The Tale of Sinuhe, from Notes on the Story of Sinuhe by Alan H. Gardner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Arnie Horton. The Tale of Sinuhe. The hereditary prince and count, governor of the domains of the sovereign in the lands of the Setu, true acquaintance of the king, beloved of him, the henchman Sinuhe, he says, I was a henchman who followed his lord, a servant of the royal harem, attending on the hereditary princess, the highly praised royal consort of Sesostris, in the pyramid town of Kenem Esot, the royal daughter of Amenemnes, in the pyramid town of Ka Nofru, even Nofru the revered. In year 30, third month of inundation, day 7, the god attained his horizon, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Sehetepre. He flew to heaven and was united with the sun's disk. The flesh of the god was merged in him who made him. Then was the residence hushed, hearts were filled with mourning, the great portals were closed, the courtiers crouched head on lap, the people grieved. Now his majesty had dispatched an army to the land of the Temhi, and his eldest son was the captain thereof, the good god Sesostris. Even now he was returning, having carried away captives of the Tehanu, and cattle of all kinds beyond number. And the companions of the royal palace sent to the western border to acquaint the king's son with the matters that had come to pass at the court. And the messengers met him on the road. They reached him at time of night. Not a moment did he wait. The falcon flew away with his henchmen, not suffering it to be known to his army. Howbeit message had been sent to the royal children who were with him in this army, and one of them had been summoned. And lo, I stood and heard his voice as he was speaking, being a little distance aloof, and my heart became distraught, my arms spread apart, trembling having fallen on all my limbs. Leaping, I betook myself thence to seek a hiding place, and placed me between two brambles, so as to sunder the road from its traveler. I set out southward, yet purposed not to approach the residence, for I thought there would be strife, and I had no mind to live after him. I crossed the waters of Mawati, hard by the sycamore, and arrived in island of Snofru. I tarried there in the open fields, and was afoot early when it was day. I met a man who rose up in my path. He showed dismay of me and feared. When the time of supper came, I drew nigh to the town of Gu. I ferried over in a barge without a rudder, by the help of a western breeze, and passed by the east of the quarry in the district mistress of the Red Mountain. I gave a road to my feet northward, and attained the wall of the prince, which was made to repel the Setu and crush the sandfarers. I bowed me down in a thicket, through fear lest the watcher on the wall for the day might see. I went on at time of night, and when it dawned I reached Petni. I halted at the island of Kemwer. An attack of thirst overtook me. I was parched, my throat burned, and I said, this is the taste of death. Then I lifted my heart and gathered up my body. I heard the sound of the lowing of cattle, and espied men of the Setu. A sheikh among them, who was aforetime in Egypt, recognized me, and gave me water. He boiled for me milk. I went with him to his tribe, and they entreated me kindly. Land gave me to land. I set forth to Byblos. I pushed on to the Kedmi. I spent half a year there. Then Enshi, son of Amu, prince of upper retinue, took me and said to me, thou farest well with me, for thou hearest the tongue of Egypt. This he said, for that he had become aware of my qualities, he had heard of my wisdom. Egyptian folk who were there with him had testified concerning me. And he said to me, wherefore art thou come hither? Hath aught befallen at the residence? And I said to him, Sehetebre is departed to the horizon, and none knoweth what has happened in this matter. And I spoke again, dissembling. I came from the expedition to the land of the Temhi, and a report was made to me. and my understanding reeled. My heart was no longer in my body. It carried me away on the path of the wastes. Yet none had spoken evil of me, none had spat in my face. I had heard no reviling word. My name had not been heard in the mouth of the herald. I know not what brought me to this country. It was like the dispensation of God. Then he said to me, how shall you land fare without him, the beneficent God, the fear of whom was throughout the lands like Sachmet in a year of plague? Spake I to him and answered him, of a truth his son has entered the palace and has taken the inheritance of his father. A God is he without a peer, none other surpasses him. A master of prudence is he, excellent in counsel, efficacious in decrees. Goings and comings are at his command. It is he who subdued the foreign lands while his father was within his palace, and reported to him what was ordered him to do. Valiant is he, achieving with his strong arm, active, and none is like to him. When he is seen charging down on Ro Petiu, or approaching the melee, a curber of horns is he, a weakener of hands. His enemies cannot marshal their ranks. Vengeful is he, a smasher of foreheads, none can stand in his neighborhood. Long of stride is he, destroying the fugitive. There is no ending for any that turn his back to him. Stout of heart is he, when he sees a multitude. He suffers not sloth to encompass his heart. Headlong is he when he falls upon the Easterners. His joy is to plunder the Ro Petiu. He seizes the buckler, he tramples under foot. He repeats not his blow in order to kill. None can turn his shaft or bend his bow. The Petiu flee before him as before the might of the great goddess. He fights without end, he spares not, and there is no remnant. He is a master of grace, great in sweetness. He conquers through love. His city loves him more than itself. It rejoices over him more than over its God. Men and women pass by in exultation concerning him now that he is king. He conquered while yet in the egg. His face has been set toward kingship ever since he was born. He is one who multiplies those who were born with him. He is unique, God-given. This land that he rules rejoices. He is one who enlarges his borders. He will conquer the southern lands, but he heeds not the northern lands. He was made to smite the Setiu, and to crush the sandfarers. Send to him, let him know thy name. Utter no curse against his majesty. He fails not to do good to the land that is loyal to him. Said he to me, of a truth Egypt is happy, since it knows that he prospers. But thou, behold, thou art here. Thou shalt dwell with me, and I will entreat thee kindly. And he placed me open before his children, and mated me with his eldest daughter. He caused me to choose for myself of his country, of the best that belonged to him on his border to another country. It was a goodly land called Ya'a. Figs were in it and grapes, and its wine was more abundant than its water. Plentiful was its honey, many were its olives. All manner of fruits were upon its trees. Wheat was in it, and spelt, and limitless cattle of all kinds. Great also was that which fell to my portion by reason of the love bestowed on me. He made me ruler of a tribe of the best of his country. Food was provided for me for my daily fare, and wine for my daily portion, cooked meat, and roast fowl, over and above the animals of the desert. For men hunted and laid before me in addition to the quarry of my dogs. And there were made for me many dainties, and milk prepared in every way. I spent many years, and my children grew up as mighty men, each one controlling his tribe. The messenger who fared north or south to the residence tarried with me, for I caused all men to tarry. I gave water to the thirsty, and set upon the road him who was strayed. I rescued him who was plundered. When the Setiu waxed insolent to oppose the chieftains of the deserts, I counseled their movements. For this prince of the retinue caused me to pass many years as commander of his host. Every country against which I marched, when I made my assault, it was driven from its pastures and wells. I spoiled its cattle. I made captive its inhabitants. I took away their food. I slew people in it. By my strong arm, by my bow, by my movements, and by my excellent counsels, I found favor in his heart, and he loved me. He marked my bravery, and placed me even before his children, when he had seen that my hands prevailed. There came a mighty man of retinue, and flaunted me in my tent. He was a champion without a peer, and had subdued the whole of retinue. He vowed that he would fight with me. He planned to rob me. He plotted to spoil my cattle. By the counsel of his tribesfolk, the prince communed with me, and I said, I know him not. Forsooth, I am no confederate of his, nor one who strode about his encampment. Yet have I ever opened his door, or overthrown his fence? Nay, it is envy, because he sees me doing thy behest. Assuredly I am like a wandering bull in the midst of a strange herd, and the steer of those cattle charges him, a longhorn attacks him. Is there a humble man who is beloved in the condition of a master? There is no pedantry that makes cause with a man of the Delta. What can fasten the papyrus to the rock? Does a bull love combat? And shall then a stronger bull wish to sound the retreat, through dread lest that one might equal him? If his heart be toward fighting, let him speak his will. Does God ignore what is ordained for him, or knows he how the matter stands? At night time I strung my bow, and tried my arrows. I drew out my dagger and polished my weapons. Day dawned, and the retinue was already come. It had stirred up its tribes, and had assembled the countries of half of it. It had planned this fight. Forth he came against me where I stood, and I posted myself near him. Every heart burned for me. Women and men jabbered. Every heart was sore for me, saying, Is this another mighty man who can fight against him? Then his shield, his battle axe, and his armful of javelins fell. When I had escaped from his weapons, and had caused his arrows to pass by me, uselessly sped, while one approached the other, I shot him, my arrow sticking in his neck. He cried aloud, and fell on his nose. I laid him low with his own battle axe, and raised my shout of victory over his back. Every am shrieked. I gave thanks to Mantu, but his serfs mourned for him. This prince Enshi, son of Amu, took me to his embrace. Then carried I off his possessions, and spoiled his cattle. What he had devised to do unto me, that did I unto him. I seized what was in his tent. I ransacked his encampment. I became great thereby. I grew large in my riches. I became abundant in my flocks. Thus God hath done, so as to shew mercy to him whom he had condemned, whom he had made wander to another land. For today is his heart satisfied. A fugitive fled in his season. Now the report of me is in the residence. A laggard lagged because of hunger. Now give I bread to my neighbor. A man left his country because of nakedness, but I am clad in white raiment and linen. A man sped for lack of one whom he should send, but I am a plenteous owner of slaves. Beautiful is my house, wide my dwelling place. The remembrance of me is in the palace. O God, whosoever thou art that didst ordain this fight, show mercy and bring me to the residence. Peradventure thou wilt grant me to see the place where my heart dwelleth. What matter is greater than that my corpse should be buried in the land wherein I was born? Come to my aid. A happy event has befallen. I have caused God to be merciful. May he do the like again, so as to ennoble the end of him he had abased, his heart grieving for him whom he had compelled to live abroad. If it so be that today he is merciful, may he hear the prayer of one afar off. May he restore him whom he had stricken to the place whence he took him. Oh, may the king of Egypt show mercy to me, that I may live by his mercy. May I salute the lady of the land who is in his palace. May I hear the behests of her children. Oh, let my flesh grow young again, for old age has befallen, feebleness has overtaken me. Mine eyes are heavy, my hands are weak, my legs refuse to follow, my heart is weary, and death approaches me. When they shall bear me to the city of eternity, let me serve my sovereign lady. Oh, let her discourse to me of her children's beauty. May she spend an eternity over me. Now it was told the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Keperkere, concerning this pass wherein I was. Thereupon his majesty sent to me with gifts of the royal bounty, and gladdened the heart of this his servant, as it had been the prince of any foreign country. And the royal children who were within his palace caused me to hear their behests. Copy of the decree which was brought to the humble servant concerning his return to Egypt. Horus, life of births, two goddesses, life of births, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Keperkere, son of Re, Sesostris, living for ever and ever. A royal decree unto the henchman Sinuhe. Behold, this decree of the king is brought to thee to instruct thee as following. Thou hast traversed the foreign lands, and art gone forth from Kedmi to Retinue. Land gave thee to land, self-consoled by thine own heart. What hadst thou done that aught should be done against thee? Thou hadst not blasphemed, that thy word should be reproved. Thou hadst not spoken in the council of the nobles, that thy utterances should be banned. This determination, it seized thine own heart, it was not in my heart against thee. This thy heaven, who is in the palace, is established and prospereth daily. She hath her part in the kingship of the land, her children are at the court. Mayest thou long enjoy the goodly things that they shall give thee. Mayest thou live by their bounty. Come now to Egypt, that thou mayest see the residence where thou didst grow, that thou mayest kiss the earth of the great portals, and have thy lot among the companions. For today already thou hast begun to be old, thy manhood is spent. Bethink thee of the day of burial, the passing into beatitude. How that the night shall be devoted to thee with ointment, with bandages from the hands of Tait, and a funeral procession shall be made for thee on a day of joining the earth. The mummy shell of gold, with head of lazuli, and a heaven above thee, and thou placed upon the hearse, oxen dragging thee, musicians in front of thee. And there shall be performed a dance of the Muu at the door of thy tomb. And the offering list shall be invoked for thee, and slaughterings made beside thy stele, thy columns being shapen of white stone amid the tombs of the royal children. Thus shalt thou not die abroad. Amu shall not escort thee. Shalt thou not be placed in a sheepskin when thy mound is made? Yea, all these things shall fall to the ground. Wherefore think of thy corpse and come. This decree reached me as I stood in the midst of my tribesfolk. It was read aloud to me, and I laid me on my belly and touched the soil. I strewed it on my hair, and I went about my encampment rejoicing and saying, how should such things be done to a servant whom his heart led astray to barbarous lands? Fair in sooth is the graciousness which delivereth me from death, inasmuch as thy Ka will grant me to accomplish the ending of my body at home. Copy of the acknowledgement of this decree. The servant of the Harem Sinuhe says, fair hail, discerned is this flight that thy servant made in his witlessness, yea, even by thy Ka, thou good God, Lord of the two lands, whom Re loves and Mantu, Lord of Thebes, praises. Amun, Lord of Karnak, Sob, Re, Horus, Hathor, Atum with his Eniat, Sopdu, Neferbayu, Semseru, Horus of the East, the Lady of Imet, who rests on thy head, the conclave upon the waters, Min in the midst of the deserts, Wereret, Lady of Punt, Har-Ure, and all the gods of Timori and of the islands of the sea. They give life and strength to thy nose. They endue thee with their gifts. They give to thee eternity illimitable. time without bourne. The fear of thee is bruited abroad in cornlands and desert hills. Thou hast subdued all the circuit of the sun. This thy servant's prayer to his Lord to rescue him in the west, the Lord of perception, who perceiveth lowly folk. He perceived it in his noble palace. Thy servant feared to speak it. Now it is like some grave circumstance to repeat it. Thou great God, peer of Re, in giving discretion to one toiling for himself, this thy servant is in the hand of a good counselor in his behoof. Verily I am pleased beneath his guidance. For thy majesty is the victorious Horus, thy hands are strong against all lands. Let now thy majesty cause to be brought Maki from Kedmi, Kentiaosh from Kentkesh, Menus from the lands of the Fenku. They are renowned princes who have grown up in love of thee, albeit unremembered. Retinue is thine, like to thy hounds. But as touching this thy servant's flight, I planned it not, it was not in my heart, I conceived it not, I know not what sundered me from my place. It was the manner of a dream, as when a Delta man sees himself in Elephantine, a man of the marshes in Ta Seti. I had not feared, none had pursued after me, I had heard no reviling word, my name had not been heard in the mouth of the herald. Nay, but my body quivered, my feet began to scurry, my heart directed me. The God who ordained this flight drew me away. Yet I am not stiff-backed, inasmuch as suffering the fear of a man that knows his land. For Re has set the fear of thee throughout the land, the dread of thee in every foreign country. Whether I be at home or whether I be in this place, it is thou that canst obscure you horizon. The sun riseth at thy pleasure, the water in the rivers is drunk at thy will, the air in heaven is breathed at thy word. Thy servant will hand over the viziership which thy servant hath held in this place. But let thy majesty do as pleaseth thee. Men live by the breath that thou givest. Re, Horus, and Hathor, love this thy august nose, which Mantu, lord of Thebes, wills shall live eternally. Envoys came to this servant, and I was suffered to spend a day in Yaa, to hand over my possessions to my children, my eldest son taking charge of my tribe, all my possessions being in his hand, my serfs and all my cattle, my fruit, and every pleasant tree of mine. Then came this humble servant southward, and halted at the pass of Horus. The commander who was there, in charge of the frontier patrol, sent a message to the residents to bear tidings. And his majesty sent a trusty head fowler of the palace, having with him ships laden with presents of the royal bounty for the Setiu that were with me to conduct me to the pass of Horus. And I named each several one of them by his name. Brewers kneaded and strained in my presence, and every serving man made busy with his task. Then I set out and sailed until I reached the town of Ichtol. And when the land was lightened and it was morning, there came men to summon me, 10 coming and 10 going to convey me to the palace, and I pressed my forehead to the ground between the sphinxes, the royal children standing in the gateway against my coming. The companions that had been ushered into the forecourt showed me the way to the hall of audience, and I found his majesty on a throne in a gateway of gold, and I stretched myself on my belly, and my wit forsook me in his presence, albeit this god greeted me joyously. Yea, I was like a man caught in the dusk, my soul fled, my flesh quaked, and my heart was not in my body, that I should know life from death. Thereupon his majesty said to one of those companions, "Raise him up, let him speak to me." And his majesty said, "Lo, thou art come, thou hast trodden the deserts, thou hast traversed the wastes, eld has prevailed against thee, thou hast reached old age. It is no small matter that thy corpse should be buried without escort of Petiu. But do not thus, staying ever speechless when thy name is pronounced. But verily I feared punishment, and answered him with the answer of one afraid. What speaketh my lord to me? Would I might answer it, and may not. Lo, it is the hand of God, yea, the dread that is in my body, like that which caused this fateful flight. Behold, I am in thy presence, thine is life. May thy majesty do as pleaseth thee. The royal children were caused to be ushered in. Then his majesty said to the royal consort, Behold Sinue, who is come as I am, an offspring of Setiu folk. She gave a great cry, and the royal children shrieked out all together. And they said to his majesty, It is not really he, O sovereign my lord. And his majesty said, Yea, it is really he. Then brought they their necklaces, their rattles, and their sistra, and presented them to his majesty. Thy hands be on the Beatus one, O enduring king, on the ornament of the Lady of Heaven. May Nub give life to thy nose. May the Lady of the Stars join herself to thee. Let the goddess of Upper Egypt fare north, and the goddess of Lower Egypt fare south, united and conjoined in the name of thy majesty. May the uraeus be set upon thy brow. Thou hast delivered thy subjects out of evil. May Re, Lord of the land, show thee grace. Hail to thee, and also to our sovereign lady. The horn of thy bow is slaked, thine arrow loosed. Give breath to one that is stifled, and grant us our goodly guerdon in the person of this Sheikh sea mate, the Pedti born in T. Murray. He fled through fear of thee, he left this land through dread of thee. But as for the face of him who sees thy majesty, it blenches not. As for the eye that regardeth thee, it fears not. Then said his majesty, Nay, but he shall not fear, he shall not dread, for he shall be a companion among the magistrates, he shall be set in the midst of the nobles. Get you gone to the chamber of adornment to wait upon him. So when I was gone forth from the hall of audience, the royal children giving me their hands, we went together to the great portals, and I was placed in the house of a royal son. There was noble equipment in it, a bathroom, and painted devices of the horizon. Costly things of the treasury were in it. Garments of royal stuff were in every chamber. Unguent and fine oil of the king and of the courtiers whom he loves. And every serving man made busy with his task. Years were caused to pass away from my flesh. I was shaved and my hair was combed. A burden was given over to the desert, and clothing to the sandfarers. And I was clad in soft linen, and anointed with fine oil. By night I lay upon a bed. I gave up the sand to them that dwell therein, and oil of wood to him who smears himself with it. There was given to me the house of a provincial governor, such as a companion may possess. Many artificers built it, and all its woodwork was new appointed. And meals were brought to me from the palace 3 times, yea 4 times a day, over and above that which the royal children gave, without remiss. And there was constructed for me a tomb of stone in the midst of the tombs. The masons that hewed tombs marked out its ground plan. The master draughtsmen designed it, the master sculptors carved in it, and the master architects who are in the necropolis bestowed their care upon it. And all the gear that is placed in a tomb shaft went to its equipment. And Ka servants were given to me, and there was made for me a sepulchral garden, in which were fields, in front of my abode, even as is done for a chief companion. And my statue was overlaid with gold, and its apron was of real gold. It was his majesty caused it to be made. There is no poor man for whom the like hath been done, and I enjoyed the favors of the royal bounty until the day of death came. It is finished from the beginning to the end, according as it was found in writing. End of the Tale of Sinue. Translated by Alan H. Gardner.
Filboid Studge, The Story of a Mouse That Helped, by Saki. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Filboid Studge: The Story of a Mouse That Helped, by Saki.
"I want to marry your daughter," said Mark Spayley with faltering eagerness. "I am only an artist with an income of $200 a year, and she is the daughter of an enormously wealthy man, so I suppose you will think my offer a piece of presumption." Duncan Dullamy, the great company inflator, showed no outward sign of displeasure. As a matter of fact, he was secretly relieved at the prospect of finding even a $200 a year husband for his daughter Leonore. A crisis was rapidly rushing upon him, from which he knew he would emerge with neither money nor credit. All his recent ventures had fallen flat, and flattest of all had gone the wonderful new breakfast food, Pipenta, on the advertisement of which he had sunk such huge sums. It could scarcely be called a drug in the market. People bought drugs, but no one bought Pipenta. "Would you marry Leonore if she were a poor man's daughter?" asked the man of phantom wealth. "Yes," said Mark, wisely avoiding the error of over protestation; and to his astonishment Leonore's father not only gave his consent, but suggested a fairly early date for the wedding. "I wish I could show my gratitude in some way," said Mark, with genuine emotion. "I'm afraid it's rather like the mouse proposing to help the lion." "Get people to buy that beastly muck," said Dullamy, nodding savagely at a poster of the despised Pipenta, "and you'll have done more than any of my agents have been able to accomplish." "It wants a better name," said Mark reflectively, "and something distinctive in the poster line. Anyway, I'll have a shot at it." 3 weeks later, the world was advised of the coming of a new breakfast food, heralded under the resounding name of Filboid Studge. Spayley put forth no pictures of massive babies springing up with fungus-like rapidity under its forcing influence, or of representatives of the leading nations of the world scrambling with fatuous eagerness for its possession. One huge, somber poster depicted the damned in hell suffering a new torment from their inability to get at the Filboid Studge which elegant young fiends held in transparent bowls just beyond their reach. The scene was rendered even more gruesome by a subtle suggestion of the features of leading men and women of the day in the portrayal of the lost souls, prominent individuals of both political parties. Society hostesses, well-known dramatic authors and novelists, and distinguished aeroplanists were dimly recognizable in that doomed throng. Noted lights of the musical comedy stage flickered wanly in the shades of the Inferno, smiling still from force of habit, but with the fearsome smiling rage of baffled effort. The poster bore no fulsome allusions to the merits of the new breakfast food, but a single grim statement ran in bold letters along its base: "They cannot buy it now." Spayley had grasped the fact that people will do things from a sense of duty which they would never attempt as a pleasure. There are thousands of respectable middle class men who, if you found them unexpectedly in a Turkish bath, would explain in all sincerity that a doctor had ordered them to take Turkish baths. If you told them in return that you went there because you liked it, they would stare in pained wonder at the frivolity of your motive. In the same way, whenever a massacre of Armenians is reported from Asia Minor, every one assumes that it has been carried out under orders from somewhere or another. No one seems to think that there are people who might like to kill their neighbors now and then. And so it was with the new breakfast food. No one would have eaten Filboid Studge as a pleasure, but the grim austerity of its advertisement drove housewives in shoals to the grocers' shops to clamor for an immediate supply. In small kitchens, solemn pigtailed daughters helped depressed mothers to perform the primitive ritual of its preparation. On the breakfast tables of cheerless parlors it was partaken of in silence. Once the womenfolk discovered that it was thoroughly palatable. Their zeal in forcing it on their households knew no bounds. "You haven't eaten your Filboid Studge," would be screamed at the appetiteless clerk as he hurried weariedly from the breakfast table, and his evening meal would be prefaced by a warmed up mess which would be explained as "your Filboid Studge that you didn't eat this morning." Those strange fanatics who ostentatiously mortify themselves inwardly and outwardly with health biscuits and health garments battened aggressively on the new food. Earnest, spectacled young then devoured it on the steps of the National Liberal Club. A bishop who did not believe in a future state preached against the poster, and a peer's daughter died from eating too much of the compound. A further advertisement was obtained when an infantry regiment mutinied and shot its officers rather than eat the nauseous mess. Fortunately, Lord Birrell of Blatherstone, who was War Minister at the moment, saved the situation by his happy epigram that "discipline to be effective must be optional." Filboid Studge had become a household word, but Dullamy wisely realized that it was not necessarily the last word in breakfast dietary. Its supremacy would be challenged as soon as some yet more unpalatable food should be put on the market. There might even be a reaction in favor of something tasty and appetizing, and the Puritan austerity of the moment might be banished from domestic cookery. At an opportune moment, therefore, he sold out his interests in the article which had brought him in colossal wealth at a critical juncture, and placed his financial reputation beyond the reach of cavil. As for Leonore, who was now an heiress on a far greater scale than ever before, he naturally found her something a vast deal higher in the husband market than a 200 a year poster designer. Mark Spayley, the brain mouse who had helped the financial lion with such untoward effect, was left to curse the day he produced the wonder working poster. "After all," said Clovis, meeting him shortly afterwards at his club, "you have this doubtful consolation, that 'tis not in mortals to countermand success." End of Filboid Studge, The Story of a Mouse That Helped, by Saki.
The Sphinx Without a Secret, by Oscar Wilde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One afternoon I was sitting outside the Café de la Paix, watching the splendour and shabbiness of Parisian life, and wondering over my vermouth at the strange panorama of pride and poverty that was passing before me, when I heard someone call my name. I turned round and saw Lord Murchison. We had not met since we had been at college together nearly 10 years before, so I was delighted to come across him again, and we shook hands warmly. At Oxford we had been great friends. I had liked him immensely. He was so handsome, so high-spirited, and so honourable. We used to say of him that he would be the best of fellows if he did not always speak the truth, but I think we really admired him all the more for his frankness. I found him a good deal changed. He looked anxious and puzzled, and seemed to be in doubt about something. I felt it could not be modern scepticism, for Murchison was the stoutest of Tories, and believed in the Pentateuch as firmly as he believed in the House of Peers. So I concluded that it was a woman, and asked him if he was married yet. "I don't understand women well enough," he answered. "My dear Gerald," I said, "women are meant to be loved, not to be understood." "I cannot love where I cannot trust," he replied. "I believe you have a mystery in your life, Gerald," I exclaimed. "Tell me about it." "Let us go for a drive," he answered. "It is too crowded here. No, not a yellow carriage, any other colour. There, That dark green one will do." And in a few moments we were trotting down the boulevard in the direction of the Madeleine. "Where shall we go to?" I said. "Oh, anywhere you like," he answered. "To the restaurant in the Bois. We will dine there, and you shall tell me all about yourself." "I want to hear about you first," I said. "Tell me your mystery." He took from his pocket a little silver-clasped morocco case and handed it to me. I opened it. Inside there was the photograph of a woman. She was tall and slight and strangely picturesque with her large, vague eyes and loosened hair. She looked like a clairvoyant and was wrapped in rich furs. "What do you think of that face?" he said. "Is it truthful?" I examined it carefully. It seemed to me the face of someone who had a secret, but whether that secret was good or evil I could not say. Its beauty was a beauty moulded out of many mysteries, the beauty, in fact, which is psychological, not plastic, and the faint smile that just played across the lips was far too subtle to be really sweet. "Well," he cried impatiently, "what do you say?" "She is the Gioconda in sables," I answered. "Let me know all about her." "Not now," he said, "after dinner," and began to talk of other things. When the waiter brought us our coffee and cigarettes, I reminded Gerald of his promise. He rose from his seat, walked 2 or 3 times up and down the room, and, sinking into an armchair, told me the following story. "One evening," he said, "I was walking down Bond Street about 5 o'clock. There was a terrific crush of carriages, and the traffic was almost stopped. Close to the pavement was standing a little yellow brougham, which for some reason or other attracted my attention. As I passed by, there looked out from it the face I showed you this afternoon. It fascinated me immediately. All that night I kept thinking of it, and all the next day. I wandered up and down that wretched row, peering into every carriage, and waiting for the yellow brougham. But I could not find ma belle inconnue, and at last I began to think she was merely a dream. About a week afterwards I was dining with Madame de Rastel. Dinner was for 8 o'clock, but at 8:30 we were still waiting in the drawing-room. Finally, the servant threw open the door and announced Lady Alroy. It was the woman I had been looking for. She came in very slowly, looking like a moonbeam in grey lace, and, to my intense delight, I was asked to take her in to dinner. After we had sat down, I remarked quite innocently, "I think I caught sight of you in Bond Street some time ago, Lady Alroy." She grew very pale, and said to me in a low voice, "Pray do not talk so loud, you may be overheard." I felt miserable at having made such a bad beginning, and plunged recklessly into the subject of the French plays. She spoke very little, always in the same low musical voice, and seemed as if she was afraid of someone listening. I fell passionately, stupidly in love, and the indefinable atmosphere of mystery that surrounded her excited my most ardent curiosity. When she was going away, which she did very soon after dinner, I asked her if I might call and see her. She hesitated for a moment, glanced round to see if anyone was near us, and then said, "Yes, tomorrow at 5:15. I begged Madame de Rastel to tell me about her, but all that I could learn was that she was a widow with a beautiful house in Park Lane, and as some scientific bore began a dissertation on widows, as exemplifying the survival of the matrimonially fittest, I left and went home. The next day I arrived at Park Lane punctual to the moment, but was told by the butler that Lady Alroy had just gone out. I went down to the club quite unhappy and very much puzzled, and after long consideration wrote her a letter, asking if I might be allowed to try my chance some other afternoon. I had no answer for several days, but at last I got a little note saying she would be at home on Sunday at 4, and with this extraordinary postscript: "Please do not write to me here again. I will explain when I see you." On Sunday she received me, and was perfectly charming, but when I was going away she begged of me, if I ever had occasion to write to her again, to address my letter to Mrs. Knox, care of Whittaker's Library, Green Street. There are reasons, she said, why I cannot receive letters in my own house. All through the season I saw a great deal of her, and the atmosphere of mystery never left her. Sometimes I thought she was in the power of some man, but she looked so unapproachable that I could not believe it. It was really very difficult for me to come to any conclusion, for she was like one of those strange crystals that one sees in museums, which are at one moment clear and at another clouded. At last I determined to ask her to be my wife. I was sick and tired of the incessant secrecy that she imposed on all my visits, and on the few letters I sent her. I wrote to her at the library to ask if she could see me the following Monday at 6. She answered yes, and I was in the 7th heaven of delight. I was infatuated with her, in spite of the mystery, I thought then. In consequence of it, I see now. No, it was the woman herself I loved. The mystery troubled me, maddened me. Why did chance put me in its track? You discovered it then, I cried. I fear so, he answered. You can judge for yourself. When Monday came round, I went to lunch with my uncle, and about 4 o'clock found myself in the Marylebone Road. My uncle, you know, lives in Regent's Park. I wanted to get to Piccadilly, and took a short cut through a lot of shabby little streets. Suddenly I saw in front of me Lady Alroy, deeply veiled and walking very fast. On coming to the last house in the street, she went up the steps, took out a latchkey, and let herself in. Here is the mystery, I said to myself, and I hurried on and examined the house. It seemed a sort of place for letting lodgings. On the doorstep lay her handkerchief, which she had dropped. I picked it up and put it in my pocket. Then I began to consider what I should do. I came to the conclusion that I had no right to spy on her, and I drove down to the club. At 6 I called to see her. She was lying on a sofa in a tea gown of silver tissue looped up by some strange moonstones that she always wore. She was looking quite lovely. "I am so glad to see you," she said. "I have not been out all day." I stared at her in amazement, and pulling the handkerchief out of my pocket, handed it to her. "You dropped this in Cumnor Street this afternoon, Lady Alroy," I said very calmly. She looked at me in terror, but made no attempt to take the handkerchief. "What were you doing there?" I asked. "What right have you to question me?" she answered. "The right of a man who loves you," I replied. "I came here to ask you to be my wife." She hid her face in her hands and burst into floods of tears. "You must tell me," I continued. She stood up and, looking me straight in the face, said, "Lord Murchison, there is nothing to tell you." "You went to meet someone," I cried. "This is your mystery." She grew dreadfully white and said, "I went to meet no one." "Can't you tell the truth?" I exclaimed. "I have told it," she replied. I was mad, frantic. I don't know what I said, but I said terrible things to her. Finally, I rushed out of the house. She wrote me a letter the next day. I sent it back unopened, and started for Norway with Alan Colville. After a month, I came back, and the first thing I saw in the Morning Post was the death of Lady Alroy. She had caught a chill at the opera, and had died in 5 days of congestion of the lungs. I shut myself up and saw no one. I had loved her so much, I had loved her so madly. Good God, how I had loved that woman. "You went to the street?" "To the house in it?" I said. "Yes," he answered. "One day I went to Cumnor Street. I could not help it. I was tortured with doubt. I knocked at the door, and a respectable-looking woman opened it to me. I asked her if she had any rooms to let. 'Well, sir,' she replied, 'the drawing-rooms are supposed to be let, but I have not seen the lady for 3 months, and as rent is owing on them, you can have them.' 'Is this the lady?' I said, showing the photograph. 'That's her, sure enough,' she exclaimed. 'And when is she coming back, sir?' 'The lady is dead,' I replied. 'Oh, sir, I hope not,' said the woman. 'She was my best lodger. She paid me 3 guineas a week merely to sit in my drawing-rooms now and then.' 'She met someone here,' I said, but the woman assured me that it was not so, that she always came alone, and saw no one. 'What on earth did she do here?' I cried. 'She simply sat in the drawing-room, sir, reading books, and sometimes had tea,' the woman answered. I did not know what to say, so I gave her a sovereign and went away. Now, what do you think it all meant? You don't believe the woman was telling the truth?' 'I do.' 'Then why did Lady Alroy go there?' 'My dear Gerald,' I answered, Lady Alroy was simply a woman with a mania for mystery. She took these rooms for the pleasure of going there with her veil down and imagining she was a heroine. She had a passion for secrecy, but she herself was merely a sphinx without a secret. "Do you really think so?" "I am sure of it," I replied. He took out the morocco case, opened it, and looked at the photograph. "I wonder," he said at last. End of The Sphinx Without a Secret by Oscar Wilde.
A Holiday in Bed and Other Sketches by J. M. Barrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Novotny, Black Forest, Germany. A Holiday in Bed. Now is the time for a real holiday. Take it in bed if you are wise. People have tried a holiday in bed before now and found it a failure, but that was because they were ignorant of the rules. They went to bed with the open intention of staying there, say 3 days, and found to their surprise that each morning they wanted to get up. This was a novel experience to them. They flung about restlessly and probably shortened their holiday. The proper thing is to take your holiday in bed with a vague intention of getting up in another quarter of an hour. The real pleasure of lying in bed after you are awake is largely due to the feeling that you ought to get up. To take another quarter of an hour then becomes a luxury. You are, in short, in the position of the man who dined on larks. Had he seen the hundreds that were ready for him, all set out on one monster dish, they would have turned his stomach, but getting them 2 at a time, he went on eating till all the larks were exhausted. His feeling of uncertainty as to whether these might not be his last 2 larks is your feeling that perhaps you will have to get up in a quarter of an hour. Deceive yourself in this way, and your holiday in bed will pass only too quickly. Sympathy is what all the world is craving for, and sympathy is what the ordinary holiday-maker never gets. How can we be expected to sympathise with you when we know you are off to Perthshire to fish? No, we say we wish we were you, and forget that your holiday is sure to be a hollow mockery, that your child will jam her finger in the railway carriage and scream to the end of the journey, that you will lose your luggage, that the guard will notice your dog beneath the seat and insist on its being paid for, that you will be caught in a Scotch mist up on top of mountain and be put on gruel for a fortnight, that your wife will fret herself into a fever about the way the servant, who has been left at home, is carrying on with her cousins, the milkman and the policeman, and that you will be had up for trespassing. Yet, when you tell her you are off tomorrow, we have never the sympathy to say, "Poor fellow, I hope you'll pull through somehow." If it is an exhibition you go to gape at, we never picture you dragging your weary legs from one department to another and wondering why your back is so sore. Should it be the seaside, we talk heartlessly to you about the briny, though we must know, if we would stop to think, that there is one holiday more miserable than all the others. It is that spent at the seaside, when you wander the weary beach and fling pebbles at the sea, and wonder how long it will be till dinner time. Were we to come down to see you, we would probably find you not on the beach, but moving slowly through the village, looking in at one milliner's window, or laboriously reading what the one grocer's labels say on the subject of pale ale, compressed beef, or vinegar. There was never an object that called aloud for sympathy more than you do, but you get not a jot of it. You should take the first train home and go to bed for 3 days. To enjoy your holiday in bed to the full, you should let it be vaguely understood that there is something amiss with you. Don't go into details, for they are not necessary, and besides, you want to be dreamy more or less, and the dreamy state is not consistent with a definite ailment. The moment one takes to bed, he gets sympathy. He may be suffering from a tearing headache or a tooth that makes him cry out, but if he goes about his business or even flops in a chair, true sympathy is denied him. Let him take to bed with one of those illnesses of which he can say with accuracy that he is not quite certain what is the matter with him, and his wife, for instance, will want to bathe his brow. She must not be made too anxious. That would not only be cruel to her, but it would wake you from the dreamy state. She must simply see that you are not yourself. Women have an idea that unless men are not themselves, they will not take to bed, and as a consequence your wife is tenderly thoughtful of you. Every little while she will ask you if you are feeling any better now, and you can reply, with the old regard for truth, that you are much about it. You may even, for your own pleasure, talk of getting up now, when she will earnestly urge you to stay in bed until you feel easier. You consent. Indeed, you are ready to do anything to please her. The ideal holiday in bed does not require the presence of a ministering angel in the room all day. You frequently prefer to be alone, and point out to your wife that you cannot have her trifling with her health for your sake, and so she must go out for a walk. She is reluctant, but finally goes, protesting yet that you are the most unselfish of men, and only too good for her. This leaves a pleasant aroma behind it, for even when lying in bed, we like to feel that we are uncommonly fine fellows. After she has gone, you get up cautiously and walk stealthily to the wardrobe, produce from the pocket of your greatcoat a good novel. A holiday in bed must be arranged for beforehand. With a gleam in your eye, you slip back to bed, double your pillow to make it higher, and begin to read. You have only got to the 4th page when you make a horrible discovery, namely that the book is not cut. An experienced holiday-maker would have cut the night before. But this is your first real holiday, or perhaps you have been thoughtless. In any case, you have now matter to think of. You are torn in 2 different ways. There is your coat on the floor with a knife in it, but you cannot reach the coat without getting up again. Ought you to get the knife or to give up reading? Perhaps it takes a quarter of an hour to decide this question, and you decide it by discovering a 3rd course. Being a sort of an invalid, you have certain privileges which would be denied you if you were merely sitting in a chair in the agonies of neuralgia. One of the glorious privileges of a holiday in bed is that you are entitled to cut books with your fingers. So you cut the novel in this way and read on. Those who have never tried it may fancy that there is a lack of incident in a holiday in bed. There could not be a more monstrous mistake. You are in the middle of a chapter when suddenly you hear a step on the stair. Your loving ears tell you that your wife has returned and is hastening to you. Now what happens? The book disappears beneath the pillow, and when she enters the room softly, you are lying there with your eyes shut. This is not merely incident. It is drama. What happens next depends on circumstances. She says in a low voice, "Are you feeling any easier now, John?" No answer. "Oh, I believe he is sleeping." Then she steals from the room, and you begin to read again. During a holiday in bed, one never thinks, of course, of analysing his actions. If you had done so, in this instance, you would have seen that you pretended to sleep because you had got to an exciting passage. You love your wife, but wife or no wife, you must see how the passage ends. Possibly the little scene plays differently, as thus. "John, are you feeling any easier now?" No answer. "Are you asleep?" No answer. Oh, what a pity. I don't want to waken him, and yet the fowl will be spoilt. Is that you back, Marian? Yes, dear. I thought you were asleep. No, only thinking. You think too much, dear. I have cooked a chicken for you. I have no appetite. Ach, I'm sorry, but I can give it to the children. Oh, as it's cooked, you may as well bring it up. In that case, the reason of your change of action is obvious. But why do you not let your wife know that you have been reading? This is another matter that you never reason about. Perhaps it is because of your craving for sympathy, and you fear that if you were seen enjoying a novel in the bed, sympathy would go. Or perhaps it is that a holiday in bed is never perfect without a secret. Monotony must be guarded against, and so long as you keep the book to yourself, your holiday in bed is a healthy excitement. A stolen book, as we may call it, is like stolen fruit, sweeter than what you can devour openly. The boy enjoys his stolen apple because at any moment he may have to slip it down the leg of his trousers and pretend that he has merely climbed the tree to enjoy the scenery. You enjoy your book doubly because you feel that it is a forbidden pleasure. Or do you conceal the book from your wife lest she should think that you are over-exerting yourself? She must not be made anxious on your account. Ah, that is it. People who pretend, for it must be pretence, that they enjoy their holiday in a country, explain that the hills or the sea give them such an appetite. I could never find myself feel the delight of being able to manage an extra herring for breakfast, but it should be pointed out that neither mountains nor oceans give you such an appetite as a holiday in bed. What makes people eat more anywhere is that they have nothing else to do. And in bed you have lots of time for meals. As for the quality of the food supplied, there is no comparison. In the Highlands, it is ham and eggs all day till you sicken. At the seaside, it is fish till the bones stick in your mouth. But in bed, oh, there you get something worth eating. You don't take 3 big meals a day, but 12 little ones, and each time it is something different from the last. There are delicacies for breakfast, for your 4 luncheons, and your 5 dinners. You explain to your wife that you have lost your appetite, and she believes you. But at the same time she has the sense to hurry on your dinner. At the clatter of dishes, for which you have been lying listening, you raise your poor head and say faintly, "Really, Marian, I can't touch food." "But this is nothing," she says, "only the wing of a partridge." You take a side glance at it and see that there is also the other wing and the body and 2 legs. Your alarm thus dispelled, you say, "I really can't." "But dear, it's so beautifully cooked." "Yes, but I have no appetite." "But try to take it, John, for my sake." Then, for her sake, you say she can leave it on the chair, and perhaps you will just taste it. As soon as she has gone, you devour that partridge, and when she comes back, she has the sense to say, "Why, you've scarcely eaten anything. What could you take for supper?" You say you can take nothing, but if she likes, she can cook a large sole, only you won't be able to touch it. "Poor dear," she says, "your appetite has completely gone." And then she rushes to the kitchen to cook the sole with her own hands. In half an hour she steals into your room with it, and then you, who have been wondering why she is such a time, start up protesting. "I hope, Marian, this is nothing for me." "Only the least little bit of a sole, dear." "But I told you I could eat nothing." "Well, this is nothing. It's so small." You look again and see with relief that it is a large sole. "I would much rather that you took it away." "But dear, I tell you I have no appetite." "Of course I know that, but how can you hope to preserve your strength if you eat so little? You've had nothing all day." You glance at her face to see if she is in earnest, for you can remember 3 breakfasts, 4 luncheons, 2 dinners, and sandwiches between, but evidently she is not jesting. Then you yield. Oh well, to keep my health up, I must just put a fork into it. Do, dear, it will do you good, though you have no caring for it. Take a holiday in bed, if only to discover what an angel your wife is. There is only one thing to guard against. Never call it a holiday. Continue not to feel sure what is wrong with you and to talk vaguely of getting up presently. Your wife will suggest calling in the doctor, but pooh-pooh him. Be firm on that point. The chances are that he won't understand your case. End of A Holiday in Bed by J. M. Barrie.
The Man Who Would Manage by Jerome K. Jerome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It has been told me by those in a position to know, and I can believe it, that at 19 months of age he wept because his grandmother would not allow him to feed her with a spoon, and that at 3½ he was fished in an exhausted condition out of the water butt, whither he had climbed for the purpose of teaching a frog to swim. 2 years later he permanently injured his left eye, showing the cat how to carry kittens without hurting them, and about the same period was dangerously stung by a bee while conveying it from a flower where, as it seemed to him, it was only wasting its time, to one more rich in honey-making properties. His desire was always to help others. He would spend whole mornings explaining to elderly hens how to hatch eggs, and would give up an afternoon's blackberrying to sit at home and crack nuts for his pet squirrel. Before he was 7 he would argue with his mother upon the management of children, and reprove his father for the way he was bringing him up. As a child, nothing could afford him greater delight than minding other children, or them less. He would take upon himself this harassing duty entirely of his own accord, without hope of reward or gratitude. It was immaterial to him whether the other children were older than himself or younger, stronger or weaker. Whenever and wherever he found them, he set to work to mind them. Once, during a school treat, piteous cries were heard coming from a distant part of the wood, and upon search being made, he was discovered prone upon the ground, with a cousin of his, a boy twice his own weight, sitting upon him and steadily whacking him. Having rescued him, the teacher said, "Why don't you keep with the little boys? What are you doing along with him?" "Please, sir," was the answer, "I was minding him." He would have minded Noah if he had got hold of him. He was a good-natured lad, and at school he was always willing for the whole class to copy from his slate. Indeed, he would urge them to do so. He meant it kindly, but inasmuch as his answers were invariably quite wrong, with a distinctive and inimitable wrongness peculiar to himself, the result to his followers was eminently unsatisfactory, and with the shallowness of youth that, ignoring motives, judges solely from results, they would wait for him outside and punch him. All his energies went to the instruction of others, leaving none for his own purposes. He would take callow youths to his chambers and teach them to box. "Now try and hit me on the nose," he would say, standing before them in an attitude of defence. "Don't be afraid. Hit as hard as ever you can." And they would do it. And so soon as he had recovered from his surprise, and a little lessened the bleeding, he would explain to them how they had done it all wrong, and how easily he could have stopped the blow if they had only hit him properly. twice at golf he lamed himself for over a week showing a novice how to drive. And at cricket on one occasion I remember seeing his middle stump go down like a ninepin just as he was explaining to the bowler how to get the balls in straight. After which he had a long argument with the umpire as to whether he was in or out. He has been known, during a stormy Channel passage, to rush excitedly upon the bridge in order to inform the captain that he had just seen a light about 2 miles away to the left. And if he is on the top of an omnibus, he generally sits beside the driver and points out to him the various obstacles likely to impede their progress. It was upon an omnibus that my own personal acquaintanceship with him began. I was sitting behind 2 ladies when the conductor came up to collect fares. One of them handed him a 6pence, telling him to take to Piccadilly Circus, which was 2pence. "No," said the other lady to her friend, handing the man a shilling. "I owe you 6pence. You give me 4pence, and I'll pay for the 2. The conductor took the shilling, punched 2 twopenny tickets, and then stood trying to think it out. "That's right," said the lady who had spoken last. "Give my friend 4pence." The conductor did so. "Now you give that 4pence to me." The friend handed it to her. "And you," she concluded to the conductor, "give me 8pence. Then we shall be all right." The conductor doled out to her the 8pence, the 6pence he had taken from the first lady, with a penny and 2 halfpennies out of his own bag, distrustfully, and retired, muttering something about his duties not including those of a lightning calculator. "Now," said the elder lady to the younger, "I owe you a shilling." I deemed the incident closed, when suddenly a florid gentleman on the opposite seat called out in stentorian tones, "Hi, conductor! You've cheated these ladies out of 4pence." "Who's cheated who out of 4pence?" replied the indignant conductor from the top of the steps. "It was a twopenny fare." "2 twopences don't make 8pence," retorted the florid gentleman hotly. "How much did you give the fellow, my dear?" he asked, addressing the first of the young ladies. "I gave him 6pence," replied the lady, examining her purse. "And then I gave you 4pence, you know," she added, addressing her companion. "That's a dear 2 pennies," chimed in a common-looking man on the seat behind. "Oh, that's impossible, dear," returned the other, "because I owed you 6pence to begin with." "But I did," persisted the first lady. "You gave me a shilling," said the conductor, who had returned, pointing an accusing forefinger at the elder of the ladies. The elder lady nodded. "And I gave you 6pence and 2 pennies, didn't I?" The lady admitted it. "And I give her," he pointed towards the younger lady, "4pence, didn't I?" "Which I gave you, you know, dear," remarked the younger lady. "Blow me if it ain't me as has been cheated out of the 4pence," cried the conductor. "But," said the florid gentleman, "the other lady gave you 6pence." "Which I give to her," replied the conductor, again pointing the finger of accusation at the elder lady. "You can search my bag if you like. I ain't got a bloomin' 6pence on me." By this time everybody had forgotten what they had done, and contradicted themselves and one another. The florid man took it upon himself to put everybody right, with the result that before Piccadilly Circus was reached 3 passengers had threatened to report the conductor for unbecoming language. The conductor had called a policeman and had taken the names and addresses of the 2 ladies, intending to sue them for the 4pence, which they wanted to pay, but which the florid man would not allow them to do. The younger lady had become convinced that the elder lady had meant to cheat her, and the elder lady was in tears. The florid gentleman and myself continued to Charing Cross Station. At the booking office window it transpired that we were bound for the same suburb, and we journeyed down together. He talked about the fourpence all the way. At my gate we shook hands, and he was good enough to express delight at the discovery that we were near neighbours. What attracted him to myself I failed to understand, for he had bored me considerably, and I had, to the best of my ability, snubbed him. Subsequently I learned that it was a peculiarity of his to be charmed with anyone who did not openly insult him. 3 days afterwards he burst into my study unannounced. He appeared to regard himself as my bosom friend, and asked me to forgive him for not having called sooner, which I did. "I met the postman as I was coming along," he said, handing me a blue envelope, "and he gave me this for you." I saw it was an application for the water rate. "We must make a stand against this," he continued. "That's for water to the 29th September. You've no right to pay it in June." I replied to the effect that water rates had to be paid, and that it seemed to me immaterial whether they were paid in June or September. "That's not it," he answered. "It's the principle of the thing. Why should you pay for water you have never had? What right have they to bully you into paying what you don't owe?" He was a fluent talker, and I was ass enough to listen to him. By the end of half an hour he had persuaded me that the question was bound up with the inalienable rights of man, and that if I paid that 14 and 10pence in June instead of in September, I should be unworthy of the privileges my forefathers had fought and died to bestow upon me. He told me the company had not a leg to stand upon, and at his instigation I sat down and wrote an insulting letter to the chairman. The secretary replied that, having regard to the attitude I had taken up, it would be incumbent upon themselves to treat it as a test case, and presumed that my solicitors would accept service on my behalf. When I showed him this letter he was delighted. "You leave it to me," he said, pocketing the correspondence, "and we'll teach them a lesson." I left it to him. My only excuse is that at the time I was immersed in the writing of what in those days was termed a comedy drama. The little sense I possessed must, I suppose, have been absorbed by the play. The magistrate's decision somewhat damped my ardour, but only inflamed his zeal. Magistrates, he said, were muddle-headed old fogies. This was a matter for a judge. The judge was a kindly old gentleman, and said that, bearing in mind the unsatisfactory wording of the sub-clause, he did not think he could allow the company their costs, so that, all told, I got off for something under £50, inclusive of the original 14 and 10pence. Afterwards our friendship waned, but living as we did in the same outlying suburb, I was bound to see a good deal of him, and to hear more. At parties of all kinds he was particularly prominent, and on such occasions, being in his most good-natured mood, was most to be dreaded. No human being worked harder for the enjoyment of others, or produced more universal wretchedness. One Christmas afternoon, calling upon a friend, I found some 14 or 15 elderly ladies and gentlemen trotting solemnly round a row of chairs in the centre of the drawing-room, while Poppleton played the piano. Every now and then Poppleton would suddenly cease, and every one would drop wearily into the nearest chair, evidently glad of a rest, all but one, who would thereupon creep quietly away, followed by the envying looks of those left behind. I stood by the door watching the weird scene. Presently an escaped player came towards me, and I inquired of him what the ceremony was supposed to signify. "Don't ask me," he answered grumpily. "Some of Poppleton's damned tomfoolery." Then he added savagely, "We've got to play forfeits after this." The servant was still waiting a favourable opportunity to announce me. I gave her a shilling not to, and got away unperceived. After a satisfactory dinner he would suggest an impromptu dance, and want you to roll up mats or help him move the piano to the other end of the room. He knew enough round games to have started a small purgatory of his own. Just as you were in the middle of an interesting discussion or a delightful tête-à-tête with a pretty woman, he would swoop down upon you with, "Come along, we're going to play literary consequences," and dragging you to the table and putting a piece of paper and a pencil before you, would tell you to write a description of your favourite heroine in fiction, and would see that you did it. He never spared himself. It was always he who would volunteer to escort the old ladies to the station, and who would never leave them until he had seen them safely into the wrong train. He it was who would play wild beasts with the children, and frighten them into fits that would last all night. So far as intention went, he was the kindest man alive. He never visited poor sick persons without taking with him in his pocket some little delicacy calculated to disagree with them and make them worse. He arranged yachting excursions for bad sailors entirely at his own expense, and seemed to regard their subsequent agonies as ingratitude. He loved to manage a wedding. Once he planned matters so that the bride arrived at the altar 3/4 of an hour before the groom, which led to unpleasantness upon a day that should have been filled only with joy. And once he forgot the clergyman. But he was always ready to admit when he made a mistake. At funerals also he was to the fore, pointing out to the grief-stricken relatives how much better it was for all concerned that the corpse was dead, and expressing a pious hope that they would soon join it. The chiefest delight of his life, however, was to be mixed up in other people's domestic quarrels. No domestic quarrel for miles round was complete without him. He generally came in as mediator, and finished as leading witness for the appellant. As a journalist or politician, his wonderful grasp of other people's business would have won for him esteem. The error he made was working it out in practice. End of The Man Who Would Manage by Jerome K. Jerome. Recording by Ruth Golding.
An Encounter by James Joyce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. An Encounter. It was Joe Dillon who introduced the Wild West to us. He had a little library made up of old numbers of the Union Jack, Pluck, and the Halfpenny Marvel. Every evening after school, we met in his back garden and arranged Indian battles. He and his fat young brother Leo, the idler, held the loft of the stable while we tried to carry it by storm, or we fought a pitched battle on the grass. But, however well we fought, we never won siege or battle, and all our bouts ended with Joe Dillon's war dance of victory. His parents went to 8 o'clock Mass every morning in Gardiner Street, and the peaceful odour of Mrs. Dillon was prevalent in the hall of the house. But he played too fiercely for us who were younger and more timid. He looked like some kind of an Indian when he capered round the garden, an old tea-cosy on his head, beating a tin with his fist and yelling, "Ya, yaka, yaka, yaka." Everyone was incredulous when it was reported that he had a vocation for the priesthood. Nevertheless, it was true. A spirit of unruliness diffused itself among us, and under its influence differences of culture and constitution were waived. We banded ourselves together, some boldly, some in jest, and some almost in fear. And of the number of these latter, the reluctant Indians who were afraid to seem studious or lacking in robustness, I was one. The adventures related in the literature of the Wild West were remote from my nature, but at least they opened doors of escape. I liked better some American detective stories which were traversed from time to time by unkempt, fierce and beautiful girls. Though there was nothing wrong in these stories, and though their intention was sometimes literary, they were circulated secretly at school. One day, when Father Butler was hearing the 4 pages of Roman history, clumsy Leo Dillon was discovered with a copy of the Halfpenny Marvel. "This page or this page? This page? Now, Dillon, up. Hardly had the day. Go on. What day? Hardly had the day dawned. Have you studied it? What have you there in your pocket?" Everyone's heart palpitated as Leo Dillon handed up the paper, and everyone assumed an innocent face. Father Butler turned over the pages, frowning. "What is this rubbish?" he said. "The Apache chief? Is this what you read instead of studying your Roman history? Let me not find any more of this wretched stuff in this college. The man who wrote it, I suppose, was some wretched scribbler who writes these things for a drink. I'm surprised at boys like you, educated, reading such stuff. I could understand it if you were national school boys. Now, Dillon, I advise you strongly, get at your work or—" This rebuke during the sober hours of school paled much of the glory of the Wild West for me, and the confused, puffy face of Leo Dillon awakened one of my consciences. But when the restraining influence of the school was at a distance, I began to hunger again for wild sensations, for the escape which those chronicles of disorder alone seemed to offer me. The mimic warfare of the evening became at last as wearisome to me as the routine of school in the morning, because I wanted real adventures to happen to myself. But real adventures, I reflected, do not happen to people who remain at home. They must be sought abroad. The summer holidays were near at hand, when I made up my mind to break out of the weariness of school life for one day at least. With Leo Dillon and a boy named Mahony, I planned a day's mitching. Each of us saved up 6pence. We were to meet at 10 in the morning on the canal bridge. Mahony's big sister was to write an excuse for him, and Leo Dillon was to tell his brother to say he was sick. We arranged to go along the wharf road until we came to the ships, then to cross in the ferry boat and walk out to see the pigeon house. Leo Dillon was afraid we might meet Father Butler or someone out of the college, but Mahony asked very sensibly what would Father Butler be doing out at the pigeon house. We were reassured, and I brought the first stage of the plot to an end by collecting 6pence from the other two, at the same time showing them my own 6pence. When we were making the last arrangements on the eve, we were all vaguely excited. We shook hands, laughing, and Mahony said, "Till tomorrow, mates." That night I slept badly. In the morning I was first comer to the bridge as I lived nearest. I hid my books in the long grass near the ash pit at the end of the garden, where nobody ever came, and hurried along the canal bank. It was a mild, sunny morning in the first week of June. I sat up on the coping of the bridge and admired my frail canvas shoes which I had diligently pipe-clayed overnight, and watching the docile horses pulling a tramload of business people up the hill. All the branches of the tall trees which lined the mall were gay with little light green leaves, and the sunlight slanted through them onto the water. The granite stone of the bridge was beginning to be warm, and I began to pat it with my hands in time to an air in my head. I was very happy. When I had been sitting there for 5 or 10 minutes, I saw Mahony's grey suit approaching. He came up the hill smiling and clambered up beside me on the bridge. While we were waiting, he brought out the catapult which bulged from his inner pocket and explained some improvements which he had made in it. I asked him why he had brought it, and he told me he had brought it to have some gas with the birds. Mahony used slang freely and spoke of Father Butler as Old Bunser. We waited on for a quarter of an hour more, but still there was no sign of Leo Dillon. Mahony at last jumped down and said, "Come along, I knew Fatty'd funk it." "And his sixpence?" I said. "That's forfeit," said Mahony, "and so much the better for us. A bob and a tanner instead of a bob." We walked along the North Strand Road till we came to the Vitriol Works, and then turned to the right along the Wharf Road. Mahony began to play the Indian as soon as we were out of public sight. He chased a crowd of ragged girls, brandishing his unloaded catapult, and when 2 ragged boys began out of chivalry to fling stones at us, he proposed that we should charge them. I objected that the boys were too small, and so we walked on, the ragged troop screaming after us, "Swaddlers! Swaddlers!" thinking that we were Protestants, because Mahony, who was dark-complexioned, wore the silver badge of a cricket club in his cap. When we came to the smoothing iron, we arranged a siege, but it was a failure because you must have at least 3. We revenged ourselves on Leo Dillon by saying what a funk he was, and guessing how many he would get at 3 o'clock from Mr. Ryan. We came then near the river, watching the working of cranes in engines, and often being shouted at for our immobility by the drivers of groaning carts. It was noon when we reached the quays, and, as all the labourers seemed to be eating their lunches, we bought 2 big currant buns and sat down to eat them on some metal piping beside the river. We pleased ourselves with the spectacle of Dublin's commerce. The barges signalled from far away by their curls of woolly smoke, the brown fishing fleet beyond Ringsend, the big white sailing vessel which was being discharged on the opposite quay. Mahony said it would be right skit to run away to sea on one of those big ships, and even I, looking at the high masts, saw or imagined the geography which had been scantily dosed to me at school gradually taking substance under my eyes. School and home seemed to recede from us, and their influences upon us seemed to wane. We crossed the Liffey in the ferryboat, paying our toll to be transported in the company of 2 labourers and a little Jew with a bag. We were serious to the point of solemnity, but once during the short voyage our eyes met and we laughed. When we landed, we watched the discharging of the graceful 3-master which we had observed from the other quay. Some bystander said that she was a Norwegian vessel. I went to the stern and tried to decipher the legend upon it, but failing to do so, I came back and examined the foreign sailors to see had any of them green eyes, for I had some confused notion. The sailors' eyes were blue and grey and even black. The only sailor whose eyes could have been called green was a tall man who amused the crowd on the quay by calling out cheerfully every time the planks fell, "All right, all right." When we were tired of this sight, we walked slowly into Ringsend. The day had grown sultry, and in the windows of the grocers' shops musty biscuits lay bleaching. We bought some biscuits and chocolate, which we ate sedulously as we wandered through the squalid streets where the families of the fishermen live. We could find no dairy, and so we went into a huckster's shop and bought a bottle of raspberry lemonade each. Refreshed by this, Mahony chased a cat down a lane, but the cat escaped into a wide field. We both felt rather tired, and when we reached the field, we made at once for a sloping bank over the ridge of which we could see the Dodder. It was too late, and we were too tired to carry out our project of visiting the pigeon house. We had to be home before 4 o'clock, lest our adventure should be discovered. Mahony looked regretfully at his catapult, and I had to suggest going home by train before he regained any cheerfulness. The sun went in behind some clouds and left us to our jaded thoughts and the crumbs of our provisions. There was nobody but ourselves in the field. When we had lain on the bank for some time without speaking, I saw a man approaching from the far end of the field. I watched him lazily as I chewed one of those green stems on which girls tell fortunes. He came along by the bank slowly. He walked with one hand upon his hip, and in the other hand he held a stick with which he tapped the turf lightly. He was shabbily dressed in a suit of greenish black, and wore what we used to call a jerry hat with a high crown. He seemed to be fairly old, for his moustache was ashen grey. When he passed at our feet, he glanced up at us quickly and then continued his way. We followed him with our eyes, and saw that when he had gone on for perhaps 50 paces, he turned about and began to retrace his steps. He walked towards us very slowly, always tapping the ground with his stick. So slowly that I thought he was looking for something in the grass. He stopped when he came level with us and bade us good day. We answered him, and he sat down beside us on the slope, slowly and with great care. He began to talk of the weather, saying that it would be a very hot summer, and adding that the seasons had changed greatly since he was a boy, a long time ago. He said that the happiest time of one's life was undoubtedly one's schoolboy days, and that he would give anything to be young again. While he expressed these sentiments, which bored us a little, we kept silent. Then he began to talk of school and of books. He asked us whether we had read the poetry of Thomas Moore, or the works of Sir Walter Scott and Lord Lytton. I pretended that I had read every book he mentioned, so that in the end he said, "Ah, I can see you are a bookworm like myself. Now," he added, pointing to Mahony, who was regarding us with open eyes, "he is different. He goes in for games." He said he had all Sir Walter Scott's works and all Lord Lytton's works at home, and never tired of reading them. Of course, he said, there were some of Lord Lytton's works which boys couldn't read. Mahony asked why couldn't boys read them, a question which agitated and pained me, because I was afraid the man would think I was as stupid as Mahony. The man, however, only smiled. I saw that he had great gaps in his mouth between his yellow teeth. Then he asked us which of us had the most sweethearts. Mahony mentioned lightly that he had 3 totties. The man asked me how many had I. I answered that I had none. He did not believe me, and said he was sure I must have one. I was silent. "Tell us," said Mahony pertly to the man, "how many have you yourself?" The man smiled as before, and said that when he was our age he had lots of sweethearts. "Every boy," he said, "has a little sweetheart." His attitude on this point struck me as strangely liberal in a man of his age. In my heart I thought that what he had said about boys and sweethearts was reasonable, but I disliked the words in his mouth, and I wondered why he shivered once or twice, as if he feared something or felt a sudden chill. As he proceeded, I noticed that his accent was good. He began to speak to us about girls, saying what nice soft hair they had, and how soft their hands were, and how all girls were not so good as they seemed to be if one only knew. There was nothing he liked, he said, so much as looking at a nice young girl, at her nice white hands, and her beautiful soft hair. He gave me the impression that he was repeating something which he had learned by heart, or that, magnetized by some words of his own speech, his mind was slowly circling round and round in the same orbit. At times he spoke as if he were simply alluding to some fact that everybody knew, and at times he lowered his voice and spoke mysteriously, as if he were telling us something secret which he did not wish others to overhear. He repeated his phrases over and over again, varying them and surrounding them with his monotonous voice. I continued to gaze towards the foot of the slope, listening to him. After a long while his monologue paused. He stood up slowly, saying that he had to leave us for a minute or so. A few minutes, and, without changing the direction of my gaze, I saw him walking slowly away from us towards the near end of the field. We remained silent when he had gone. After a silence of a few minutes, I heard Mahony exclaim, "I say, look what he's doing!" As I neither answered nor raised my eyes, Mahony exclaimed again, I say, but he's a queer old josser. In case he asked for our names, I said, let you be Murphy and I'll be Smith. We said nothing further to each other. I was still considering whether I would go away or not when the man came back and sat down beside us again. Hardly had he sat down when Mahony, catching sight of the cat which had escaped him, sprang up and pursued her across the field. The man and I watched the chase. The cat escaped once more, and Mahony began to throw stones at the wall she had escalated. Desisting from this, he began to wander about the far end of the field aimlessly. After an interval, the man spoke to me. He said that my friend was a very rough boy and asked did he get whipped often at school. I was going to reply indignantly that we were not national school boys to be whipped, as he called it, but I remained silent. He began to speak on the subject of chastising boys. His mind, as if magnetized again by his speech, seemed to circle slowly round and round its new centre. He said that when boys were that kind they ought to be whipped and well whipped. When a boy was rough and unruly, there was nothing would do him any good but a good sound whipping. A slap on the hand or a box on the ear was no good. What he wanted was to get a nice warm whipping. I was surprised at this sentiment and involuntarily glanced at his face. As I did so, I met the gaze of a pair of bottle-green eyes peering at me from under a twitching forehead. I turned my eyes away again. The man continued his monologue. He seems to have forgotten his recent liberalism. He said that if ever he found a boy talking to girls or having a girl for a sweetheart, he would whip him, and that would teach him not to be talking to girls. And if a boy had a girl for a sweetheart and told lies about it, then he would give him such a whipping as no boy ever got in this world. He said that there was nothing in this world he would like so well as that. He described to me how he would whip such a boy as if he were unfolding some elaborate mystery. He would love that, he said, better than anything in this world. And his voice, as he led me monotonously through the mystery, grew almost affectionate and seemed to plead with me that I should understand him. I waited till his monologue paused again. Then I stood up abruptly. Lest I should betray my agitation, I delayed a few moments, pretending to fix my shoe properly, and then saying that I was obliged to go, I bade him good day. I went up the slope calmly, but my heart was beating quickly with fear that he would seize me by the ankles. When I reached the top of the slope, I turned round, and without looking at him, called loudly across the field, "Murphy!" My voice had an accent of forced bravery in it, and I was ashamed of my paltry stratagem. I had to call the name again before Mahony saw me and hallooed in answer. How my heart beat as he came running across the field to me. He ran as if to bring me aid, and I was penitent, for in my heart I had always despised him a little. End of An Encounter by James Joyce.
Tony's Wife by Alice Dunbar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Tony's Wife by Alice Dunbar. "Give me 5 cents worth of candy, please." It was the little Jew girl who spoke, and Tony's wife roused herself from her knitting to rise and count out the multi-hued candy which should go in exchange for the dingy nickel grasped in warm, damp fingers. 3 long sticks, carefully wrapped in crispest brown paper, and a half-dozen or more of pink candy fish for lagniappe, and the little Jew girl sped away in blissful contentment. Tony's wife resumed her knitting with a stifled sigh until the next customer should come. A low growl caused her to look up apprehensively. Tony himself stood beetle-browed and huge in the small doorway. "Get up from there," he muttered, "and open 2 dozen oysters right away. The Elliots want 'em." His English was unaccented. It was long since he had seen Italy. She moved meekly behind the counter and began work on the thick shells. Tony stretched his long neck up the street. "Mr. Tony, Mama wants some charcoal." The very small voice at his feet must have pleased him, for his black brows relaxed into a smile, and he poked the little one's chin with a hard, dirty finger, as he emptied the ridiculously small bucket of charcoal into the child's bucket, and gave a banana for lagniappe. The cracking of shells went on behind, and a stifled sob arose as a bit of sharp edge cut into the thin, worn fingers that clasped the knife. "Hurry up there, will you?" growled the black brows. "The Elliots are sending for the oysters." She deftly strained and counted them, and, after wiping her fingers, resumed her seat and took up the endless crochet work with her usual stifled sigh. Tony and his wife had always been in this same little queer old shop on Prytania Street, at least to the memory of the oldest inhabitant of the neighborhood. When or how they came, or how they stayed, no one knew. It was enough that they were there, like a sort of ancestral fixture to the street. The neighborhood was fine enough to look down upon these two tumble‐down shops at the corner, kept by Tony and Mrs. Murphy the grocer. It was a semi‐fashionable locality, far uptown, away from the old‐time French Quarter. It was the sort of neighborhood where millionaires live before their fortunes are made, and fashionable, high‐priced private schools flourish, where the small cottages are occupied by aspiring school teachers and choir singers. Such was this locality, and you must admit that it was indeed a condescension to tolerate Tony and Mrs. Murphy. He was a great, black‐bearded, hoarse‐voiced, 6 foot specimen of Italian humanity, who looked in his little shop and on the prosaic pavement of Prytania Street somewhat as Hercules might seem in a modern drawing‐room. You instinctively thought of wild mountain passes and the gleaming dirks of bandit contadini in looking at him. What his last name was, no one knew. Someone had maintained once that he had been christened Antonio Malatesta, but that was unauthentic, and as little to be believed as that other wild theory that her name was Mary. She was meek, pale, little, ugly, and German. Altogether part of his arms and legs would have very decently made another larger than she. Her hair was pale and drawn in sleek, thin tightness away from a pinched, pitiful face, whose dull cold eyes hurt you, because you knew they were trying to mirror sorrow and could not because of their expressionless quality. No matter what the weather or what her other toilet, she always wore a thin little shawl of dingy brick‐dust hue about her shoulders. No matter what the occasion or what the day, she always carried her knitting with her, and seldom ceased the incessant twist, twist of the shining steel among the white cotton meshes. She might put down the needles and lace into the spool box long enough to open oysters, or wrap up fruit and candy, or count out wood and coal into infinitesimal portions, or do her housework. But the knitting was snatched with avidity at the first spare moment, and the worn, white, blue‐marked fingers, half enclosed in kid‐glove stalls for protection, would writhe and twist in and out again. Little girls just learning to crochet borrowed their patterns from Tony's wife, and it was considered quite a mark of advancement to have her inspect a bit of lace done by eager, chubby fingers. The ladies in larger houses, whose husbands would be millionaires some day, bought her lace and gave it to their servants for Christmas presents. As for Tony, when she was slow in opening his oysters or in cooking his red beans and spaghetti, he roared at her and prefixed picturesque adjectives to her lace, which made her hide it under her apron with a fearsome look in her dull eyes. He hated her in a lusty, roaring fashion, as a healthy, beefy boy hates a sick cat and torments it to madness. When she displeased him, he beat her, and knocked her frail form on the floor. The children could tell when this had happened. Her eyes would be red, and there would be blue marks on her face and neck. "Poor Mrs. Tony," they would say, and nestle close to her. Tony did not roar at her for petting them, perhaps because they spent money on the multi-hued candy in glass jars on the shelves. Her mother appeared upon the scene once, and stayed a short time, but Tony got drunk one day and beat her because she ate too much, and she disappeared soon after. Whence she came and where she departed, no one could tell, not even Mrs. Murphy, the Pauline Pry and Gazette of the block. Tony had gout, and suffered for many days in roaring helplessness, the while his foot, bound and swathed in many folds of red flannel, lay on the chair before him. In proportion as his gout increased, and he bawled from pure physical discomfort, she became light-hearted, and moved about the shop with real brisk cheeriness. He could not hit her then, without such pain that after one or two trials he gave up in disgust. So the dull years had passed, and life had gone on pretty much the same for Tony and the German wife and the shop. The children came on Sunday evenings to buy the stick candy, and on week-days for coal and wood. The servants came to buy oysters for the larger houses, and to gossip over the counter about their employers. The little dry woman knitted, and the big man moved lazily in and out in his red flannel shirt, exchanged politics with the tailor next door through the window, or lounged into Mrs. Murphy's bar and drank fiercely. Some of the children grew up and moved away, and other little girls came to buy candy and eat pink lagniappe fishes, and the shop still thrived. One day Tony was ill, more than the mummified foot of gout or the wheeze of asthma. He must keep his bed and send for the doctor. She clutched his arm when he came, and pulled him into the tiny room. "Is it anything much, doctor?" she gasped. Aesculapius shook his head as wisely as the occasion would permit. She followed him out of the room into her shop. Will he get well, doctor?" Aesculapius buttoned up his frock coat, smoothed his shining hat, cleared his throat, then replied oracularly, "Madam, he is completely burned out inside. Empty as a shell, madam, empty as a shell. He cannot live, for he has nothing to live on." As the cobblestones rattled under the doctor's equipage rolling leisurely up Prytania Street, Tony's wife sat in her chair and laughed with a hearty joyousness that lifted the film from the dull eyes and disclosed a sparkle beneath. The drear days went by, and Tony lay like a veritable Samson shorn of his strength, for his voice was sunk into a hoarse, sibilant whisper, and his black eyes gazed fiercely from the shock of hair and beard about a white face. Life went on pretty much as before in the shop. The children paused to ask how Mr. Tony was, and even hushed the jingles of their bell hoops as they passed the door. Red-headed Jimmy, Mrs. Murphy's nephew, did the hard jobs, such as splitting wood and lifting coal from the bin, and in the intervals between tending the fallen giant and waiting on the customers, Tony's wife sat in her accustomed chair, knitting fiercely, with an inscrutable smile about her purple compressed mouth. Then John came, introducing himself, serpent-wise, into the Eden of her bosom. John was Tony's brother, huge and bluff too, but fair and blond, with the beauty of northern Italy. With the same lack of race pride which Tony had displayed in selecting his German spouse, John had taken unto himself Betty, a daughter of Erin, aggressive, powerful, and cross-eyed. He turned up now, having heard of this illness, and assumed an air of remarkable authority at once. A hunted look stole into the dull eyes, and after John had departed with blustering directions as to Tony's welfare, she crept to his bedside timidly. "Tony," she said, "Tony, you are very sick." An inarticulate growl was the only response. "Tony, you ought to see the priest. You mustn't go any longer without taking the sacrament." The growl deepened into words. "Don't want any priest. You're always after some sniveling old woman's fuss. You and Mrs. Murphy go on with your church. It won't make you any better." She shivered under this parting shot, and crept back into the shop. Still the priest came next day. She followed him into the bedside and knelt timidly. "Tony," she whispered, "here's Father Leblanc." Tony was too languid to curse out loud. He only expressed his hate in a toss of the black beard and shaggy mane. "Tony," she said nervously, "won't you do it now? It won't take long, and it will be better for you when you go. Oh, Tony, don't laugh. Please, Tony, here's the priest." But the Titan roared aloud. "No, get out! Think I'm a going to give you a chance to grab my money now? Let me die and go to hell in peace." Father Leblanc knelt meekly and prayed, and the woman's weak pleadings continued. "Tony, I've been true and good and faithful to you. Don't die and leave me no better than before. Tony, I do want to be a good woman once, a real for true married woman. Tony, here's the priest. Say yes." And she wrung her ringless hands. "You want my money," said Tony slowly, "and you shan't have it. Not a cent. John shall have it." Father Leblanc shrank away like a fading spectre. He came next day, and next day, only to see reenacted the same piteous scene, the woman pleading to be made a wife ere death hushed Tony's blasphemies, the man chuckling in pain-racked glee at the prospect of her bereaved misery. Not all the prayers of Father Leblanc, nor the wailings of Mrs. Murphy, could alter the determination of the will beneath the shock of hair. He gloated in his physical weakness at the tenacious grasp on his mentality. "Tony," she wailed on the last day, her voice rising to a shriek in its eagerness, "tell them I'm your wife. It'll be the same. Only say it, Tony, before you die." He raised his head and turned stiff eyes and gibbering mouth on her. Then, with one chill finger pointing at John, fell back dully and heavily. They buried him with many honors by the Society of Italia's Sons. John took possession of the shop when they returned home, and found the money hidden in the chimney corner. As for Tony's wife, since she was not his wife after all, they sent her forth in the world penniless, her worn fingers clutching her bundle of clothes in nervous agitation, as though they regretted the time lost from knitting. End of Tony's Wife by Alice Dunbar.
That Spot by Jack London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. I don't think much of Stephen Mackaye any more, though I used to swear by him. I know that in those days I loved him more than my brother. If ever I meet Stephen Mackaye again, I shall not be responsible for my actions. It passes beyond me that a man with whom I shared food and blanket, and with whom I mushed over the Chilcoot Trail, should turn out the way he did. I always sized Steve up as a square man, a kindly comrade, without an iota of anything vindictive or malicious in his nature. I shall never trust my judgment in men again. Why, I nursed that man through typhoid fever. We starved together on the headwaters of the Stewart, and he saved my life on the Little Salmon. And now, after the years we were together, all I can say of Stephen Mackay is that he is the meanest man I ever knew. We started for the Klondike in the fall rush of 1897, and we started too late to get over Chilcoot Pass before the freeze-up. We packed our outfit on our backs part way over, when the snow began to fly, and then we had to buy dogs in order to sled it the rest of the way. That was how we came to get that Spot. Dogs were high, and we paid $110 for him. He looked worth it. I say looked, because he was one of the finest appearing dogs I ever saw. He weighed 60 pounds, and he had all the lines of a good sled animal. We never could make out his breed. He wasn't husky, or Malamute, nor Hudson Bay. He looked like all of them, and he didn't look like any of them. And on top of it all, he had some of the white man's dog in him, for on one side, in the thick of the mixed yellow, brown, red, and dirty white that was his prevailing colour, there was a spot of coal-black as big as a water-bucket. That was why we called him Spot. He was a good looker, all right. When he was in condition, his muscles stood out in bunches all over him. And he was the strongest-looking brute I ever saw in Alaska, also the most intelligent-looking. To run your eyes over him, you'd think he could outpull 3 dogs of his own weight. Maybe he could, but I never saw it. His intelligence didn't run that way. He could steal and forage to perfection. He had an instinct that was positively gruesome for divining when work was to be done and for making a sneak accordingly. And for getting lost and not staying lost he was nothing short of inspired. But when it came to work, the way that intelligence dribbled out of him and left him a mere clot of wobbling, stupid jelly would make your heart bleed. There are times when I think it wasn't stupidity. Maybe, like some men I know, he was too wise to work. I shouldn't wonder if he put it all over us with that intelligence of his. Maybe he figured it all out and decided that a licking now and again and no work was a whole lot better than work all the time and no licking. He was intelligent enough for such a computation. I tell you, I've sat and looked into that dog's eyes till the shivers run up and down my spine and the marrow crawled like yeast. What of the intelligence I saw shining out? I can't express myself about that intelligence. It is beyond mere words. I saw it, that's all. At times it was like gazing into a human soul to look into his eyes, and what I saw there frightened me and started all sorts of ideas in my own mind of reincarnation and all the rest. I tell you, I sensed something big in that brute's eyes. There was a message there, but I wasn't big enough myself to catch it. Whatever it was, it baffled me. I can't give an inkling of what I saw in that brute's eyes. It wasn't light, it wasn't colour. It was something that moved away back when the eyes themselves weren't moving. And I guess I didn't see it move either. I only sensed that it moved. It was an expression, that's what it was, and I got an impression of it. No, it was different from a mere expression. It was more than that. I don't know what it was, but it gave me a feeling of kinship just the same. Oh no, not sentimental kinship. It was rather a kinship of equality. Those eyes never pleaded like a deer's eyes. They challenged. No, it wasn't defiance. It was just a calm assumption of equality. And I don't think it was deliberate. My belief is that it was unconscious on his part. It was there because it was there, and it couldn't help shining out. No, I don't mean shine. It didn't shine. It moved. I know I'm talking rot, but if you'd looked into that animal's eyes the way I have, you'd understand. Steve was affected the same way I was. Why, I tried to kill that Spot once. He was no good for anything, and I fell down on it. I led him out into the brush, and he came along slow and unwilling. He knew what was going on. I stopped in a likely place, put my foot on the rope, and pulled my big Colts. And that dog sat down and looked at me. I tell you, he didn't plead. He just looked. And I saw all kinds of incomprehensible things moving, yes, moving, in those eyes of his. I didn't really see them move. I thought I saw them. For, as I said before, I guess I only sensed them. And I want to tell you right now that it got beyond me. It was like killing a man. A conscious, brave man, who looked calmly into your gun as much as to say, "Who's afraid?" Then, too, the message seemed so near that, instead of pulling the trigger quick, I stopped to see if I could catch the message. There it was, right before me, glimmering all around in those eyes of his. And then it was too late. I got scared. I was trembly all over, and my stomach generated a nervous palpitation that made me seasick. I just sat down and looked at that dog, and he looked at me, till I thought I was going crazy. Do you want to know what I did? I threw down the gun and ran back to camp with the fear of God in my heart. Steve laughed at me, but I noticed that Steve led Spot into the woods a week later for the same purpose, and that Steve came back alone, and a little later Spot drifted back too. At any rate, Spot wouldn't work. We paid $110 for him from the bottom of our sack, and he wouldn't work. He wouldn't even tighten the traces. Steve spoke to him the first time we put him in harness, and he sort of shivered. That was all. Not an ounce on the traces. He just stood still and wobbled like so much jelly. Steve touched him with the whip. He yelped, but not an ounce. Steve touched him again, a bit harder, and he howled. The regular long wolf howl. Then Steve got mad and gave him half a dozen, and I came on the run from the tent. I told Steve he was brutal with the animal, and we had some words, the first we'd ever had. He threw the whip down in the snow and walked away, mad. I picked it up and went to it. That Spot trembled and wobbled and cowered before ever I swung the lash, and with the first bite of it he howled like a lost soul. Next he lay down in the snow. I started the rest of the dogs, and they dragged him along, while I threw the whip into him. He rolled over on his back and bumped along, his 4 legs waving in the air, himself howling as though he was going through a sausage machine. Steve came back and laughed at me, and I apologized for what I'd said. There was no getting any work out of that Spot, and to make up for it, he was the biggest pig glutton of a dog I ever saw. On top of that, he was the cleverest thief. There was no circumventing him. Many a breakfast we went without our bacon, because Spot had been there first, and it was because of him that we nearly starved to death up the Stewart. He figured out the way to break into our meat cache, and what he didn't eat, the rest of the team did. But he was impartial. He stole from everybody. He was a restless dog, always very busy snooping around or going somewhere. And there was never a camp within 5 miles that he didn't raid. The worst of it was that they always came back on us to pay his board bill, which was just, being the law of the land, but it was mighty hard on us, especially that first winter on the Chilkoot, when we were busted paying for whole hams and sides of bacon that we never ate. He could fight too, that Spot. He could do everything but work. He never pulled a pound, but he was the boss of the whole team. The way he made those dogs stand around was an education. He bullied them, and there was always one or more of them fresh marked with his fangs. But he was more than a bully. He wasn't afraid of anything that walked on 4 legs, and I've seen him march single-handed into a strange team without any provocation whatever, and put the kibosh on the whole outfit. Did I say he could eat? I caught him eating the whip once. That's straight. He started in at the lash, and when I caught him he was down to the handle and still going. But he was a good looker. At the end of the first week we sold him for $75 to the mounted police. They had experienced dog drivers, and we knew that by the time he'd covered the 600 miles to Dawson, he'd be a good sled dog. I say we knew, for we were just getting acquainted with that Spot. A little later we were not brash enough to know anything where he was concerned. A week later we woke up in the morning to the dangdest dog fight we'd ever heard. It was that Spot come back, and knocking the team into shape. We ate a pretty depressing breakfast, I can tell you, but cheered up 2 hours afterward when we sold him to an official courier, bound in to Dawson with government dispatches. That Spot was only 3 days in coming back, and, as usual, celebrated his arrival with a rough house. We spent the winter and spring, after our own outfit was across the pass, freighting other people's outfits, and we made a fat stake. Also, we made money out of Spot. If we sold him once, we sold him 20 times. He always came back, and no one asked for their money. We didn't want the money. We'd have paid handsomely for anyone to take him off our hands for keeps. We had to get rid of him, and we couldn't give him away, for that would have been suspicious. But he was such a fine looker that we never had any difficulty in selling him. Unbroke, we'd say, and they'd pay an old price for him. We sold him as low as $25, and once we got back $150 for him. That particular party returned him in person, refused to take his money back, and the way he abused us was something awful. He said it was cheap at the price to tell us what he thought of us, and we felt he was so justified that we never talked back. But to this day I've never quite regained all the old self-respect that was mine before that man talked to me. When the ice cleared out of the lakes and rivers, we put our outfit in a Lake Bennett boat and started for Dawson. We had a good team of dogs, and of course we piled them on top the outfit. That Spot was along. There was no losing him, and a dozen times the first day he knocked one or other of the dogs overboard in the course of fighting with them. It was close quarters, and he didn't like being crowded. "What that dog needs is space," Steve said the second day. "Let's maroon him." We did, running the boat in at Caribou Crossing for him to jump ashore. 2 of the other dogs, good dogs, followed him, and we lost 2 whole days trying to find them. We never saw those 2 dogs again, but the quietness and relief we enjoyed made us decide, like the man who refused his $150, that it was cheap at the price. For the first time in months Steve and I laughed and whistled and sang. We were as happy as clams. The dark days were over. The nightmare had been lifted. That Spot was gone. 3 weeks later, one morning, Steve and I were standing on the river bank at Dawson. A small boat was just arriving from Lake Bennett. I saw Steve give a start, and heard him say something that was not nice, and that was not under his breath. Then I looked, and there, in the bow of the boat, with ears pricked up, sat Spot. Steve and I sneaked immediately, like beaten curs, like cowards, like absconders from justice. It was this last that the lieutenant of police thought when he saw us sneaking. He surmised that there were law officers in the boat who were after us. He didn't wait to find out, but kept us in sight, and in the M&M saloon got us in a corner. We had a merry time explaining, for we refused to go back to the boat and meet Spot, and finally he held us under guard of another policeman while he went to the boat. After we got clear of him we started for the cabin, and when we arrived, there was that Spot sitting on the stoop waiting for us. Now how did he know we lived there? There were 40,000 people in Dawson that summer, and how did he savvy our cabin out of all the cabins? How did he know we were in Dawson anyway? I leave it to you. But don't forget what I have said about his intelligence, and that immortal something I have seen glimmering in his eyes. There was no getting rid of him any more. There were too many people in Dawson who had bought him up on Chilkoot, and the story got around. 6 times we put him on board steamboats going down the Yukon, and he merely went ashore at the first landing and trotted back up the bank. We couldn't sell him, we couldn't kill him, both Steve and I had tried, and nobody else was able to kill him. He bore a charmed life. I've seen him go down in a dog fight in the main street with 50 dogs on top of him, and when they were separated he'd appear on all his 4 legs, unharmed, while 2 of the dogs that had been on top of him would be lying dead. I saw him steal a chunk of moose meat from Major Dinwiddie's cache, so heavy that he could just keep one jump ahead of Mrs. Dinwiddie's squaw cook, who was after him with an axe. As he went up the hill, after the squaw gave out, Major Dinwiddie himself came out and pumped his Winchester into the landscape. He emptied his magazine twice and never touched that spot. Then a policeman came along and arrested him for discharging firearms inside the city limits. Major Dinwiddie paid his fine, and Steve and I paid him for the moose meat at the rate of $1 a pound, bones and all. That was what he paid for it. Meat was high that year. I'm only telling what I saw with my own eyes, and now I'll tell you something also. I saw that Spot fall through a water hole. The ice was 3½ feet thick, and the current sucked him under like a straw. 300 yards below was the big water hole used by the hospital. Spot crawled out of the hospital water hole, licked off the water, bit out the ice that had formed between his toes, trotted up the bank, and whipped a big Newfoundland belonging to the Gold Commissioner. In the fall of 1898 Steve and I poled up the Yukon on the last water, bound for Stewart River. We took the dogs along, all except Spot. We figured we'd been feeding him long enough. He'd cost us more time and trouble and money and grub than we got by selling him on the Chilkoot, especially grub. So Steve and I tied him down in the cabin and pulled our freight. We camped that night at the mouth of Indian River, and Steve and I were pretty facetious over having shaken him. Steve was a funny cuss, and I was just sitting up in the blankets and laughing when a tornado hit camp. The way that Spot walked into those dogs and gave them what for was hair-raising. Now, how did he get loose? It's up to you. I haven't any theory. And how did he get across the Klondike River? That's another facer. And anyway, how did he know we had gone up the Yukon? You see, we went by water, and he couldn't smell our tracks. Steve and I began to get superstitious about that dog. He got on our nerves, too, and, between you and me, we were just a mite afraid of him. The freeze-up came on when we were at the mouth of Henderson Creek, and we traded him off for 2 sacks of flour to an outfit that was bound up White River after copper. Now that whole outfit was lost. Never trace nor hide nor hair of men, dogs, sleds, nor anything was ever found. They dropped clean out of sight. It became one of the mysteries of the country. Steve and I plugged away up the Stewart, and 6 weeks afterward that Spot crawled into camp. He was a perambulating skeleton and could just drag along, but he got there. And what I want to know is who told him we were up the Stewart. We could have gone 1,000 other places. How did he know? You tell me, and I'll tell you. No losing him. At the Mayo he started a row with an Indian dog. The buck who owned the dog took a swing at Spot with an axe, missed him, and killed his own dog. Talk about magic and turning bullets aside. I, for one, consider it a blamed sight harder to turn an axe aside with a big buck at the other end of it. And I saw him do it with my own eyes. That buck didn't want to kill his own dog. You've got to show me. I told you about Spot breaking into our meat cache. It was nearly the death of us. There wasn't any more meat to be killed, and meat was all we had to live on. The moose had gone back several hundred miles, and the Indians with them. There we were. Spring was on, and we had to wait for the river to break. We got pretty thin before we decided to eat the dogs, and we decided to eat Spot first. Do you know what that dog did? He sneaked. Now, how did he know our minds were made up to eat him? We sat up nights laying for him, but he never came back. And we ate the other dogs. We ate the whole team. And now for the sequel. You know what it is when a big river breaks up and a few billion tons of ice go out, jamming and milling and grinding. Just in the thick of it, when the Stewart went out, rumbling and roaring, we sighted Spot out in the middle. He'd got caught as he was trying to cross up above somewhere. Steve and I yelled and shouted and ran up and down the bank, tossing our hats in the air. Sometimes we'd stop and hug each other. We were that boisterous, for we saw Spot's finish. He didn't have a chance in a million. He didn't have any chance at all. After the ice run, we got into a canoe and paddled down to the Yukon, and down the Yukon to Dawson, stopping to feed up for a week at the cabins at the mouth of Henderson Creek. And as we came in to the bank at Dawson, there sat Spot, waiting for us, his ears pricked up, his tail wagging, his mouth smiling, extending a hearty welcome to us. How did he get out of that ice? How did he know we were coming to Dawson, to the very hour and minute, to be out there on the bank waiting for us? The more I think of that Spot, the more I am convinced that there are things in this world that go beyond science. On no scientific grounds can that Spot be explained. It's psychic phenomena, or mysticism, or something of that sort, I guess, with a lot of theosophy thrown in. The Klondike is a good country. I might have been there yet and become a millionaire if it hadn't been for Spot. He got on my nerves. I stood him for 2 years altogether, and then I guess my stamina broke. It was the summer of 1899 when I pulled out. I didn't say anything to Steve, I just sneaked. But I fixed it up all right. I wrote Steve a note and enclosed a package of rough-on rats, telling him what to do with it. I was worn down to skin and bone by that Spot, and I was that nervous that I'd jump and look around when there wasn't anybody within hailing distance. But it was astonishing the way I recuperated when I got quit of him. I got back £20 before I arrived in San Francisco, and by the time I'd crossed the ferry to Oakland, I was my old self again, so that even my wife looked in vain for any change in me. Steve wrote to me once, and his letter seemed irritated. He took it kind of hard because I'd left him with Spot. Also, he said he'd used the rough-on rats per directions, and that there was nothing doing. A year went by. I was back in the office and prospering in all ways, even getting a bit fat. And then Steve arrived. He didn't look me up. I read his name in the steamer list and wondered why. But I didn't wonder long. I got up one morning and found that Spot chained to the gatepost and holding up the milkman. Steve went north to Seattle, I learned, that very morning. I didn't put on any more weight. My wife made me buy him a collar and tag, and within an hour he showed his gratitude by killing her pet Persian cat. There is no getting rid of that Spot. He will be with me until I die, for he'll never die. My appetite is not so good since he arrived, and my wife says I am looking peaked. Last night that Spot got into Mr. Harvey's hen house — Harvey is my next-door neighbour — and killed 19 of his fancy-bred chickens. I shall have to pay for them. My neighbours on the other side quarrelled with my wife and then moved out. Spot was the cause of it, and that is why I am disappointed in Stephen Mackay. I had no idea he was so mean a man. End of That Spot by Jack London.
The Dumb Man by Sherwood Anderson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for LibriVox.org by Tom Merritt. There's a story. I cannot tell it. I have no words. The story is almost forgotten, but sometimes I remember. The story concerns 3 men in a house in a street. If I could say the words, I would sing the story. I would whisper it into the ears of women, of mothers. I would run through the street saying it over and over. My tongue would be torn loose. It would rattle against my teeth. The 3 men are in a room in the house. One is young and dandified. He continually laughs. There is a second man who has a long white beard. He is consumed with doubt. But occasionally his doubt leaves him, and he sleeps. A third man there is who has wicked eyes and who moves nervously about the room, rubbing his hands together. The 3 men are waiting. Upstairs in the house there's a woman standing with her back to a wall in half darkness by a window. That is the foundation of my story, and everything I will ever know is distilled in it. I remember that a fourth man came to the house, a white, silent man. Everything was as silent as the sea at night. His feet on the stone floor of the room where the three men were made no sound. The man with the wicked eyes became like a boiling liquid. He ran back and forth like a caged animal. The old gray man was infected by his nervousness. He kept pulling at his beard. The fourth man, the white one, went upstairs to the woman. There she was, waiting. How silent the house was, how loudly all the clocks in the neighborhood ticked. The woman upstairs craved love. That must have been the story. She hungered for love with her whole being. She wanted to create and love. When the white silent man came into her presence, she sprang forward. Her lips were parted. There was a smile on her lips. The white one said nothing. In his eyes there was no rebuke, no question. His eyes were as impersonal as stars. Downstairs the wicked one whined and ran back and forth like a little lost hungry dog. The gray one tried to follow him about, but presently grew tired and lay down on the floor to sleep. He never awoke again. The dandified fellow lay on the floor too. He laughed and played with his tiny black mustache. I have no words to tell what happened in my story. I cannot tell the story. The white silent one may have been death. The waiting, eager woman may have been life. Both the old gray bearded man and the wicked one puzzle me. I think and think, but cannot understand them. Most of the time, however, I do not think of them at all. I keep thinking about the dandified man who laughed all through my story. If I could understand him, I could understand everything. I could run through the world telling a wonderful story. I would no longer be dumb. Why was I not given the words? Why am I dumb? I have a wonderful story to tell, but know no way to tell it. End of The Dumb Man by Sherwood Anderson. Read for LibriVox.org by Tom Merritt.
From the Teeth of the Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Teeth of the Tide by Charles G.D. Roberts. From the House in the Water, a book of animal stories. Hitherto, ever since he had been old enough to leave the den, the mother bear had been leading her fat black cub inland, among the tumbled rocks and tangled spruce and pine, teaching him to dig for tender roots and nose out grubs and beetles from the rotting stumps. Today, feeling the need of saltier fare, she led him in the opposite direction, down through a cleft in the cliffs, and out across the great, red, glistening mud flats left bare by the ebb of the terrific Fundy tides. From the secure warmth of his den, the cub had heard, faint and far off, the waves thundering along the bases of the cliffs when the tide was high and the great winds drew heavily in from the sea. The sounds had always made him afraid, and today, though there was no wind, and the tide was so far out that it made no noise but a soft whisper, silken and persuasive, he held back with babyish timidity till his mother brought him to his senses with an unceremonious cuff on the side of the head. With a squall of grieved surprise, he picked himself up, shaking his head as if he had a bee in his ear, and then made haste to follow obediently, close at his mother's huge black heels. From the break in the cliffs, where the bears came down, ran a ledge of shelving rocks on a long, gradual slant across the flats toward the edge of low water.
The tide was nearing the last of the ebb, and now, the slope of the shore being very gradual, and the difference between high and low water in these turbulent channels something between 40 and 50 feet, the lapsing fringes of the ebb, yellow tawny with silt, were a good 3/4 of a mile away from the foot of the cliffs. The vast spaces between were smooth, oily, copper-red mud, shining and treacherous in the sun, with the narrow black outcrop of the ledge drawn across on so gentle a slant that before it reached the water it was running almost on a parallel with the shoreline. Along the rocky ledge the old bear led the way, pausing to nose at a patch of seaweed here and there, or to glance shrewdly into the shallow pools among the rocks. The cub obediently followed her example, though doubtless with no idea of what he might hope to find. But the upper stretches of the ledge, near high water mark, offered nothing to reward their quest, having been dry for several hours, and long ago thoroughly gone over by earlier foragers. So the bears pushed on down towards the lower stretches, where the ledges were still wet, and the long black-green weed masses still dripping, and where the limpet-covered protuberances of rock still oozed and sparkled. With her iron-hard claws the mother bear scraped off a quantity of these limpets, and crushed them between her jaws with relish, swallowing the salty juices. The cub tried clumsily to imitate her, but the limpets defied his too tender claws, so he ran to his mother, thrust her great head aside, and greedily licked up a share of her scrapings. The sea flavor tickled his palate, but the rough hard shells exasperated him. They hurt his gums, so that he merely rolled them over in his mouth, sucked at them a few moments, then spat them out indignantly. His mother thereupon forsook the unsatisfactory limpets, and went prowling on towards the water's edge in search of more satisfying fare. As they left the limpets, a gaunt figure in grey homespuns, carrying a rifle, appeared on the crest of the cliffs above, caught sight of them, and hurriedly took cover behind an overhanging pine. The young woodsman's first impulse was to try a long shot at the hulking black shape so conspicuous out on the ledge against the bright water. He wanted a bearskin, even if the fur was not just then in prime condition, but more particularly he wanted the cub, to tame and play with if it should prove amenable, and to sell ultimately for a good amount to some traveling show. On consideration, he decided to lie in wait among the rocks till the rising tide should drive the bears back to the upland. He exchanged his steel-nosed cartridges for the more deadly mushroom tip, filled his pipe, and lay back comfortably against the pine trunk to watch, through the thin green frondage, the foraging of his intended prey. The farther they went down the long slant of the ledge, the more interested the bears became. Here the crows and gulls had not had time to capture all the prizes. There were savory blue-shelled mussels clinging under the tips of the rocks, plump spiral whelks between the oozy tresses of the seaweed, orange starfish, and bristly sea urchins in the shallow pools. All these dainties had shells that the cub's young teeth could easily crush, and they yielded meaty morsels that made beetles and grubs seem very meagre fare. Moreover, in the salty bitter of this sea fruit there was something marvelously stimulating to the appetite. From pool to pool the old bear wandered on, lured ever by richer prizes just ahead, and the cub, stuffed till his little stomach was like a black furry ball, no longer frisked and tumbled, but waddled along beside her with eyes of shiny expectancy. As long as he was not too full to walk, he was not too full to eat such delicacies as these. The fascinating quest led them on and on, till at last they found themselves at the water's edge. By this time they had travelled a long way from the cleft in the cliffs by which they had come down from the uplands. A good half-mile of shining mud separated them in a direct line from the cliff base, and the woodsman on the height, as he watched them, muttered to himself,
"If that old bar don't look out, the tide's a-goin' to catch her afore she knows what she's about. Most wish I'd a-socked it to her afore she'd got so far out. Jiminy, she's seed her mistake now. The tide's turned."
While bear and cub had their noses and paws busy in a little dry pool, On a sudden, a long, shallow, muddy-crested wave had come hissing up over their feet and filled the pool to the brim with its yellow flood. Lifting her head sharply, the old bear glanced at the far-off cliffs and at the mounting tide. Instantly realizing the peril, she started back at a slow, lumbering amble up the long, long path by which they had come. And the cub started too at a brave gallop not far behind her, for he was too much afraid of the hissing yellow wave, but close at her side, between her sheltering form and the shore. He felt that she could in some way ward off or subdue the cold and terrifying monster. For perhaps 2 minutes the cub struggled on gamely, although owning to the fact that at this point their path was almost parallel with the water. The fugitives made no perceptible gain, and the rising wave was on their heels every instant. Then the greedy feeding produced its effect. The little fellow's wind gave out completely. With a whimper of pain and fright, he dropped back upon his haunches and waited for his mother to save him. The old bear turned, bounced back, and cuffed him so brusquely that he found breath enough to utter a loud squall and go stumbling forward for another score of yards. Then he gave out and sank upon his too distended stomach, whimpering piteously. This time the mother seemed to perceive that his case was serious, and her anxious wrath subsided. She licked him assiduously for a few seconds, whining encouragement, till at last he got upon his feet again, trembling. The yellow flood was now lapping on the ledge all about them, but a rod or two farther on the rocks bulged up a couple of feet above the surrounding slope. Thrusting the exhausted youngster ahead of her with nose and paws, the old bear gained this point of temporary vantage, and then, worried and frightened, sat down upon her haunches and stared all around her, as if trying to decide what should be done. The cub lay flat, with legs outstretched and mouth wide open, panting. The tide, meanwhile, was mounting so swiftly that in a few moments the rise of rocks had become almost an island. The ledge was covered before them as well as behind, and the only way still open lay straight over the glistening mud. The old bear looked at it and whined, knowing its treacheries, and the woodsman, watching with eager interest from the cliffs, muttered,
"Take to it, ye old bug-eater. Thar ain't nothin' else left for ye to do."
This was apparently the conclusion of the old bear herself, for now, after licking and nuzzling the cub for a few seconds till he stood up, she stepped boldly off the rock and started out over the coppery flats. The cub, having apparently recovered his wind, followed briskly, probably much heartened by the fact that his progress was in a direction away from the alarming waves. There was a desperate need of haste, for when they left the rocky lift, the tide was already slipping around upon the flats beyond it. Nevertheless, the old bear moved with deliberation. She could not hurry the cub, and she had to choose her path. By some instinct, or else by some peculiar keenness of observation, she seemed to detect the honey pots, or deep pockets of slime, that lay concealed beneath the uniformly shining surface of the mud. For here she would make an aimless detour, losing many precious seconds, and there she would sidestep suddenly for several paces and shift her course to a new parallel. Outside the honey pots the mud was soft and tenacious, to a depth varying from a few inches to a couple of feet, but with a hard clay foundation beneath the slime. Through this clinging red ooze the old bear, with her huge strength, made her way without difficulty. But the cub, in a few moments, began to find himself terribly hampered. His fur collected the mud, his little paws sank easily, but at each step it grew harder to withdraw them. At last, chancing to stagger aside from his mother's spacious tracks, he sank to his belly in the rim of a honey pot. Panic-stricken, he floundered vainly, his nose high in the air and his eyes shut tight, while his mother, unconscious of what had happened, ploughed doggedly onward. Presently he opened his eyes, His mother was now perhaps 10 or a dozen feet ahead, apparently deserting him. Right behind, lapping up to his very tail, was the crawling wave. A heartbroken bawl burst from his throat. At that cry, the old bear came dashing back, red mud halfway up her flanks and plastered all over her shaggy chest. Taking in the situation at a glance, she seized the cub by the nape of the neck with her teeth and tried to drag him free. But he squealed so lamentably that she realized that the hide would yield before the mud would. The attempt had taken time, however, and the tide was now well up in the fur of his back. Thrusting her paw down beneath his haunches, she tore him clear with a mighty wrench and a loud sucking of the baffled mud. That stroke sent him head over heels some 10 feet nearer safety. By the time he had picked himself off, pawing fretfully at the mud that bedaubed his face and half blinded him, his mother was close behind him, nosing him along and lifting him forward skillfully with her forepaws. The slope of the flats was now so gradual as to be almost imperceptible, and the tide, therefore, seemed to be racing in with fiercer haste, as if in wrath at being so long balked of its prey. Engrossed in her efforts to push the cub forward, the mother now lost some of her fine discrimination in regard to honeypots. She pushed the cub straight into one, but jerked him back unceremoniously before the mud had time to get any grip upon him. Pausing for a moment to scrutinize the oozy expanse, she thrust the little animal furiously along to the left, searching for a safe passage. Before she could find one, however, the tide was upon them, their feet splashing in the thin yellow wavelets. A broken soap-box, tossed overboard from some ship, came washing up and stranded just before them. With a whimper of delight, as if he thought the box a safe refuge, the cub scrambled upon it. But his mother ruthlessly tumbled him off and hustled him onward, floundering and splashing.
"You'll have to swim for it, old woman,"
growled the now excited watcher behind the pine tree on the cliff. As the creeping flood by this time overspread the ooze for a couple of yards ahead of them, the mother could no longer discriminate as to what lay beneath it. She could do nothing now but dash ahead blindly. Catching up the cub between her jaws, in a grip that made him squeal, she launched herself straight toward shore, hardly daring to let her feet rest an instant where they touched. Fortune favored her in this rush. She got ahead of the tide. She gained upon it, perhaps twice her body's length. Then she paused to drop the cub. But the pause was fatal. She began to sink instantly. She had come upon a honeypot of stiffer consistency than the rest, which had sustained her while she was in swift motion, but now, in return for that support, clutched her in a grip the more inexorable. With all her huge strength, she strained to wrench herself clear, but in vain. She had no purchase. There was nothing to put forth her strength upon. In her terror and despair, she squealed aloud, with her snout high in the air, as if appealing to the blank, blue, empty sky. The cub, terror-stricken, strove to clamber upon her back. That harsh cry of hers, however, was but the outburst of one moment's weakness. The next moment, the indomitable old bear was striving silently and systematically to release herself. She would wrench one great forearm clear, lift it high, and feel about for a solid foundation beneath the ooze. Failing in this, she would yield that paw to the enemy again, tear the other loose, and feel about for a foothold in another direction. At the same time, she drew out her body to its full length and lay flat, so that she might gain as much support as possible by distributing her weight. Because of this sagacity, and because the mire at this point had more substance than in most of the other honeypots, she made a good fight, and almost, but not quite, held her own. By the time the tide had once more overtaken her, she had sunk but a little way, and was still far from giving up the unequal struggle. Yet for all the great beast's strength and valor and devotion, there could have been but one end to that brave battle, and mother and cub would have disappeared in a few minutes more under the stealthily whispering onrush of the flood, had not the whimsical Providence or hazard of the wild come curiously to their aid. Among the jetsam of those restless, fundy tides, almost anything that will float may appear, from a matchbox to a barn. What appeared just now was a big spruce log, escaped from the boom on some river, emptying into the bay. It came softly wallowing in, lipped by the little waves, and passed close by the nose of the old bear, where she struggled with the water up to her shoulders. Quick as thought, she flashed up a heavy paw, caught the log by one end, and pulled the butt under her chest. The purchase thus gained enabled her to free the other paw, and in a few seconds more the weight of the fore part of her body was on the end of the log, forcing it down to the mud. Greedy as that mud was, it was yet incapable of engulfing a full-grown spruce timber quickly enough to defeat the bear's purpose. Stretching far forward on the submerged log, she strained her muscles to their utmost and slowly drew her hindquarters free from the deadly grip that held them. Then, seizing in her jaws the cub, which was swimming and whimpering beside her, she carefully felt her way farther along the log and sat down upon it to rest, clutching the youngster closely in one great forearm. Not till the tide had risen nearly to her neck did the mother move again. She was recovering her strength. Utterly daunted by the peril of the honeypots, she chose rather to trust the tide itself. At last, catching the cub again by the back of the neck, she swam for the shore. The tide was now within a couple of 100 yards from the bases of the cliffs, and lapping upon solid, sun-baked clay. The strong flood helping her, she swam fast, though laboriously by reason of the burden in her teeth. Soon her hinder feet struck ground, but she was afraid to trust it, and nervously drew them up beneath her. A few moments more, and she felt undeniably firm footing, whereupon she plunged forward with a rush, and never paused, even to drop the squirming cub, till she was above high water mark. When at last she set the little beast down, she was in such a hurry to get away from the shore, and back into the secure green woods, that she would not trust him to follow her as usual, but drove him on ahead, as fast as he could move toward the cleft in the cliffs. As they turned up the rugged trail, her haste relaxed, and she went more slowly, but still driving the cub ahead of her, that she might be quite sure that the honeypots would not reach up and clutch at him again. As the muddy, weary, bedraggled, pathetic-looking pair passed within tempting range of the pine tree on the cliff-top, the woodsman instinctively threw forward his rifle. But the next moment he dropped it, with a slight flush, and gave a quick glance around him as if he feared that unseen eyes might have taken note of the gesture.
"Hell," he'd muttered, "I'd a been no better'n a murderer if I'd a gone and plugged the old girl now."
End of From the Teeth of the Tide by Charles G.D. Roberts. Read by Jewel.